Hey everyone. Hello everyone watching. This is Ben Norton with the Grayzone. I'm joined by my fellow Grayzone colleagues, Max Blumenthal and Anya Parampil. We're also speaking with the journalist Kevin Gosztola, a friend of us, friend of our shows, a great reporter. You can check out his website at Shadowproof. That's shadowproof.com, and I'll plug that more later as we start talking about one of the main topics today. That's Julian Assange. So I'm not going to really speak too much today. I'm just mostly going to do technical stuff because we have
You're
a
allowed
big
to speak,
roster.
Ben, we really we welcome your opinion, and everybody's going to talk. And I think our viewers want you to speak. So
Yeah, well,
let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, we have a lot of guests today. So right now we have four of us, but we're also going to have Aaron Maté going to join us in a little bit. And then later on, we're going to have another friend, Danny Haiphong, and we're going to talk about Julian Assange. We're going to talk about the violence going on with the Stop the Steal protests in Washington, D.C. And we're going to talk about a variety of issues, the force, the vote, aftermath. So there's a lot to get at, but this week has been pretty important, and I'm going to cut to Kevin here. Kevin, you have been reporting a lot on Julian Assange. This should be a case that gets more mainstream corporate media coverage. It, of course, doesn't get much, and when it does, it doesn't. I think it doesn't address just how monstrous the treatment of this journalist has been. So there's a lot we can talk about today. We're going to talk about the CIA spying. We're going to talk about the torture he's been subjected to. We're going to talk about the judgment by the British judge, which is Orwellian in so many other ways. But let's just start with, Kevin, can you talk about what happened this week with Julian Assange and fill in for people who don't necessarily follow the case?
No. Oh, well, so I'll start broadly, and then as you're saying there's a lot of specifics we could get into, but very broadly, we had the extradition decision, which was on Monday. That was January 4th. And the judge denied the extradition request from the U.S. government. But most importantly, she basically endorsed almost every single prosecutorial argument that had been put forward about the crimes that were alleged against Julian Assange. And she accepted that Julian Assange, as the U.S. government depicted him, or as the Crown Prosecution Service depicted him, they're the body that represents the U.S. government interests in this extradition case. Judge Vanessa Baretzer accepted that Julian Assange was not a journalist when he was in communication with Chelsea Manning, the source of the documents published back in 2010. And that he basically did almost all the things, or that there's evidence that he did almost all of the acts that are alleged against him by the U.S. government. She accepted the U.S. government's characterization of WikiLeaks as a criminal enterprise. It's essentially in the business of hacking government documents, and that it's not, a legitimate media organization. And so I think that's rather alarming, and that was something that press freedom organizations like Reporters Without Borders rightfully condemned immediately. And it made the outcome very bittersweet, because while Julian Assange did win, while the extradition request was rejected, it left a kind of precedent that had been expected all along. We knew that there was a potential that this could happen with the district court. The last thing I'll color in here is that essentially the U.S. government would have prevailed if not for the fact that our mass incarceration system in the United States is so cruel and brutal that the judge determined that the U.S. was intent to put Julian Assange under something called special administrative measures in a supermax prison in ADX Florence, Colorado, and that he would be there in these supermax conditions, essentially put under these special administrative measures. And there he would not have the same access to mental health services. So his recurring depressive disorder, as well as the fact that he's on the autism spectrum, that would all continue his deterioration, his psychological duress, the sort of psychological torment that he's endured over the last 10 years of arbitrary detention would immediately be compounded much more severely. And then he would turn to trying to commit suicide. And the people in the facility would not be able to stop him because he would have the wherewithal and commitment to complete this act. And knowing that, she was unwilling to grant the extradition request. And then so fast forward to today, very quickly, there was a bail application hearing. And then, on one hand, there is a consistency to what she was doing, which we can talk about. But I will say that the decision to deny him bail and keep him in the high security prison known as Belmarsh, where he's been since April 2019, defies a lot of logic in the one sense of if she actually is concerned about his mental health, she would probably have left him, allowed him to leave the Belmarsh high security prison and go serve, time on house arrest while this appeal unfolded. Because in her own decision, there is a section that points out that Julian Assange himself has been hiding details about his condition from psychiatrists because he does not want to be put under a kind of constant watch that would amount to torture inside of HMP Belmarsh. And so that to me seems like the same exact evidence that weighed in her consideration to deny the extradition. And yet here, she's clearly serving some kind of owners, some kinds of people in these institutions in the security apparatus of the United Kingdom. She's deferring to people in higher positions of power and keeping him in the Belmarsh prison.
Hey, Kevin, thanks for being with us here. And what's up, everybody? I know there's other live streams that you could be paying attention to. Thank you to Mini Ninja Love, but we are really focused on Assange at the top of this live stream. But I just got back from the Stop the Steal protest, really just up the street from here. So we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about Force the Vote. I'm going to be telling you what I saw. I was damn near a witness to the killing of a young woman there. And I think it's important. It's all one piece. Everything is one piece here. And there was so much rage that I saw there at the media, at the mainstream media. People were just surrounding this little cage of mainstream reporters and just shouting at them. Everybody is angry at the media. And I might not, relate to them, but Ben just published a piece last night about how CNN was used, an article in CNN, which I wrote about, by a right-wing Ecuadorian reporter from an NGO called Transparency International, previously a fellow there. An NGO funded by the State Department and the British Foreign Office wrote this article just straight up smearing Julian Assange as essentially a Russian agent who had turned the Ecuadorian embassy into a palace for hackers. And the article was fake from top to bottom. But what's most significant about it is that the source for this article was the CIA contractor UC Global that was spying on Julian Assange. And they just straight up lied about it. Basically what I'm saying here is that CNN was used and enthusiastically played this role in one of the greatest attacks on a free press in our time. So I wonder if you could each address that, and then we'll, pass it to Anya, who's sitting right here, and I'm struggling to read the comments on screen because you don't have your glasses on. So if you see her like that, don't trip.
You're muted.
Ben, you're on mute.
Cool. Yeah, I'll just summarize the article quick, Kevin, and then I'll cut to you. So at the Grayzone, I just published this piece we just had up talking, as Max just spelled out. There is a Spanish firm that's called UC Global. It's a private security company, and it's run by this guy who's a former special operations officer for the Spanish military named David Morales. He was arrested in 2019 and is currently under investigation by the Spanish High Court. Although ironically, he was released on bail. He's actually wanted for real criminal charges, whereas Julian Assange, who has not committed any crime, was not released on bail and it continues to be tortured in a high security prison, Belmarsh prison in London, that is for so-called terror suspects. But I mean, the hypocrisy aside, so CNN, as Max spelled out, CNN relied on these reports, these just bogus so-called intelligence reports written by UC Global, which has a total, it was in the vested interest of this firm that was working for the CIA to try to portray Assange as someone who was suspicious in committing crimes because it helps justify the narrative of the people that pay it, the CIA. And I'm going to get up the article here and go through the relevant parts because it's frankly pretty shocking that, I mean, even the very circular element, the circular narrative of this aside, I mean, let's just look at the language. So here it is. This is the piece, UK judge justifies CIA spying on Assange based on the CNN report. So if you go down here, this is the relevant section I have up from, this is the judgment by Vanessa Beretzer. She's the district judge for Westminster Court. And here she says, a possible alternative explanation for U.S. surveillance, if there was any, she adds in parentheses, is the perception that Mr. Assange remained a risk to their national security. So keep in mind here that she's doing two things. You might not be able to read this well, but the UK judge is simultaneously downplaying, disputing, casting doubt on the existence of the CIA spying operation targeting Assange, while she also justifies that CIA spying operation. And the part in the highlight here says, a CNN report from 15 July 2019 entitled Security Reports Reveal How Assange Turned an Embassy into a Command Post for Election Meddling. I mean, that's incredible. She's saying that Assange was working with the Russian government to meddle in the U.S. election. And another part, and she cites this 2 times, by the way, in the ruling. And another detail here in this piece, I talk about this former Ecuadorian diplomat, Fidel Narvaez. We've interviewed him several times at the Grayzone, and he wrote an article actually at the Grayzone you can find, and he actually debunked 40 rebuttals. He found 40 examples of false claims by CNN in its reporting on Julian Assange. But in this, he addresses the CNN report where they say that he turned the Ecuadorian embassy into a command post for meddling. And there's 2 points that in his response here. Again, this is the Ecuadorian diplomat who was working in the Ecuadorian embassy in London when Julian Assange was there, not only with asylum, by the way, but Julian Assange was actually given citizenship by the Ecuadorian government. And in this piece that the former Ecuadorian diplomat wrote, he number 4 here in his list of 40 fact checks of the CNN article, he's quoting a line from the CNN report. It says, these stunning details come from hundreds of surveillance reports compiled for the Ecuadorian government by UC Global, a private Spanish security company, and obtained by CNN. So in response to that, the Ecuadorian diplomat says, this is stunning that CNN considers the reports produced by UC Global as reliable. I know personally that they do not reflect reality. UC Global produced misrepresented, exaggerated, hostile reports loaded with paranoia and sometimes false information. And he says, those of us who knew what was going on inside the embassy knew that all of the reports they created were going in one direction, sowing suspicion about Assange and his visits in order to justify the work of the security company. And I would add, not only justify the work of the security company, but rather justify extradition. Because the whole point of this is that the CIA was spying on Assange to find a reason to justify extraditing him to the United States. And actually, the day after Vanessa Beretzer released her report, there was another report that that was filed, I'm going to get this up here as well, in El País, which is one of the top Spanish newspapers, which is saying new clues point to the CIA spying on Assange in order to extradite him. So this is one of the top Spanish newspapers acknowledging the fact that the CIA was spying on Assange. What was the goal? To extradite him. So, I mean, it's just really wild that you have corporate media outlets, CNN, these so-called journalists relying on a CIA-backed firm without disclosing in the article that this firm was working for the CIA in order to spy on Assange, and then the UK judge uses that CIA evidence to justify CIA spying. It's truly outrageous. So, but I'll cut to you, Kevin.
Yeah, so in her justification, she's saying essentially, although she had committed to not really formulating an opinion about this surveillance, she basically does here. And she says that this is probably because Julian Assange posed a national security threat to the United States. And as you say, she's referencing this article. And, you know, I mean, I have the introduction before me because I wrote about it. And I just want to be clear at how much it didn't even prove. It says, new documents obtained exclusively by CNN reveal that WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange received in-person deliveries, potentially of hacked materials related to the 2016 U.S. election during a series of suspicious meetings at the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Potentially suspicious meetings. They have no idea what's happening in any of these activities that unfolded. This is all conjecture for the purposes of advancing the CIA's narrative about what Julian Assange was doing from within this embassy and to basically justify the kind of attention that was given. And so now El País is saying that this was for the purposes of, or helping to confirm that this was for the purpose of bolstering the extradition case against Assange. And so let's be clear too, that El País also had these same documents at almost exactly the same time that CNN had these documents and put out on a completely different story about what was going on here. They got it correct. They looked at these documents and said the UC Global firm was targeting Julian Assange's legal team and was bugging the women's bathrooms. They were putting microphones in different parts of the embassy. They were turning CCTV cameras into devices that were constantly streaming audio, constantly collecting audio, not streaming, but collecting audio that could be uploaded to a remote server in the United States to collect this intelligence, to collect this surveillance information against Julian Assange. And so yeah, this is a prime example in the decision of a corporate news outlet being used to further the prosecution or the political persecution of Julian Assange. Another example, I mean, I know you might have other things to say, but if I could just quickly toss this out here. Another example that comes up in the decision is The Guardian. And The Guardian is cited in this, and I put them in the same bucket as CNN when it comes to being invoked to further this extradition case, because they're referenced because they ran really quickly to publish an article condemning WikiLeaks for publishing 250,000 unredacted cables without taking any steps whatsoever to prepare them so that people who were named in it wouldn't face repercussions or any kind of retaliation. What isn't acknowledged by the judge is that it's David Lee and Luke Harding of The Guardian who publish a book that has as its chapter the password key for the encrypted file that had this entire cache of cables on the internet. And then some people out on the in Germany at a newspaper called Die Freitag are doing their own sleuthing and eventually connect that password key to the file that they've come across on the internet, and they're able to crack into it. And Julian Assange is on the phone to the State Department, panicked. We have the audio of him. It's quite incredible, at least the first part of it. I'd never heard it before, although it was referenced in the extradition case. But of all places, it's Project Veritas that is posting this audio of this call with the counsel at the State Department. And, we're hearing Julian Assange explain that they need to do something now in order to protect their own people. And you read this decision and there is no reflection of this consideration, this care that Julian Assange had about the risks that were going to come to people working with the State Department. That doesn't even surface at all in her decision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and really quickly thank some of our super chatters, Sandite26, as well as Ken Leary, Rare Wolf, and TM. I'm leaning in sometimes to get a closer look at the chat, so that's why you see me squinting and getting closer to the camera. But I wondered, Kevin, of course, most of our viewers, if I'm sure all of them, and everyone on this stream knows that the case the United States brought against Assange is completely dangerous for free speech, and would have loved for Judge Baratzer to have thrown it out on those merits or lack of alone. But in some ways, I wonder if the fact that she's now made this about the U.S. prison system, if that actually makes the appeals process and the U.S. government's case more difficult to make in the future, because it probably wouldn't be difficult to find another judge who would rubber stamp the case against Assange with all the pressure the United States has placed on the UK. But if you're going to make it about prison conditions and the fact that he could potentially commit suicide in the United States in U.S. custody, that actually, I think, complicates the U.S. government's case going forward. Probably isn't something that they wanted to have to argue about in the future. And so I wonder your take on that. And then also, I've heard that for reporters who were covering the day-by-day trial the way you were, that there were some details regarding Assange's mental health, his family history, and perhaps even suicide attempts in Belmarsh that weren't previously known to the public. So I wonder if you can illuminate some of those issues which were brought up in the trial.
Well, so first I'll work backwards, and I'll start with what we know about Assange health and how he's been treated in Belmarsh prison. Importantly, she accepted that the discovery of half of a razor blade that Julian Assange apparently had in his possession was something that was serious. That was highly disputed by the prosecution during the extradition trial. They acted like it wasn't anything serious. And so she did factor that in, if he was able to have that, what if he ended up in a U.S. prison, was able to find something like that in order to engage in self-mutilation? And in particular, when you read the kind of nightmares at the facility ADX Florence that have been detailed, there are things in there where people have broken pieces of glass and digested them just for the purpose of getting out of the solitary confinement and horrific conditions that they are put in ADX Florence. So this is a place that drives people mad. There's an excellent article from Westward, which is a local newspaper near in and around the Denver area in Colorado, that looks at the H unit, which is where people who are placed under special administrative measures would go, like Julian Assange. And just so people are clear, SAMS is something that the Attorney General designates you as essentially a kind of national security threat. Exactly what we would expect them to believe, and how they would view Julian Assange if he wound up in the United States. And then what that means is they're able to do all kinds of things to you, like restricting your phone calls, the kind of people you can communicate with, limiting it to a very small amount of family members that you can contact. And so, yeah, during the trial, we heard about his mental and his physical health. It was important to have details brought out about him being on the autism spectrum, simply for the fact of, like, now I think one of the more important articles that I wrote during the extradition trial had to do with making this connection between his case and the case of Lori Love and Gary McKinnon, who were two hackers, or two people, sorry, who were alleged to have committed major hacking crimes against the United States, and were people who had mental health issues that were recognized, and the courts in the United Kingdom saw that if they were extradited to the US prisons, they would suffer the same kind of cruel and inhuman treatment that the judge is recognizing in her extradition decision. So we had that come out during the extradition trial. We also had things like Julian Assange suffers from osteoporosis and would be vulnerable in prison to potentially bending over, and there could be fracturing of the ribs. And if that happened, we all know that the healthcare system is not really much of a healthcare system at all in prisons. It's basically like a void, and they do everything to not provide you healthcare. And in fact, an advocate who has been outspoken for Julian Assange, CIA whistleblower Jeffrey Sterling, has basically a horror story of his own when he was in prison because he was about to suffer a heart attack and needed to get medical treatment outside of the federal correctional institution where he was held. And it took a pressure campaign to get him moved to get this treatment. So we know things like that, the physical and the mental health issues that Julian Assange is suffering from, the only way he would get treatment is if there were campaigns like what we've seen around Free Assange that would then get him pressure. There would be pressure, and then the warden would have to allow him outside treatment at a hospital in the United States. It wouldn't come from within a prison hospital. And the thing that the judge is looking at with HMP Belmarsh is that they do have facilities there that can provide for health, treating the health of Julian Assange. And so I don't think it's a great place to be. I think that there are things about it that are nightmarish, especially how one of Julian's friends committed suicide in the prison toward the end of last year because he feared that he was going to be deported to Jair Bolsonaro's Brazil. He was a gay man and didn't want to be deported back to Brazil. But that being said, there are some things that are offered, specific services to Julian Assange that ADX Florence was never going to provide for somebody like Assange. To your other question, you asked, sorry, would you ask me on?
Just about whether or not that the judge has made this about the U.S. prison system as opposed to the merits of the case itself actually complicates U.S. defense.
Yeah, and I would agree with you. I think that's actually an excellent point. And there isn't much to add because I think in your question, you articulate it pretty well because to me, it would have been easy for the U.S. government to perhaps clarify if the judge had decided that they hadn't proven the Espionage Act charges, or if there was something about Julian Assange that the judge agreed was journalism, or if perhaps she thought they had not proven the computer crime. We had seen going into the extradition decision that there could be a possibility of a split decision where she had rejected half of the charges or a few of the charges. And so then there would have been a possible scenario where Assange's legal team had to appeal, but then the U.S. also appealed as well on the charges that were rejected. And then you sort of have those going at the same time through the court system. But it's very, very limited. It's all about the way that they presented prison evidence and what they wouldn't tell the judge and the assurances that they would not give the judge. And at no point did this assistant U.S. attorney, who was basically treated like a kind of saintly fellow during it. I mean, I tell you, Gordon Kromberg, this assistant U.S. attorney, anything that he put on the record was treated like incontrovertible fact. Like nobody could question him.
And this is the guy behind all the 9/11 trials, the phony trials of Muslim civil society. I think he was behind the Holy Land Foundation. I mean, and he was notorious for anti-Muslim tirades in the courtroom. I even saw him deliver just straight up Islamophobic tirades. I mean, he was a straight up ideologue. He went on a special trip to Israel and wrote about how much it moved him to be there. And he was close friends with Stephen Emerson. I think he basically modeled all his prosecutions off of Steve Emerson's book about like Islamic penetration of America. And then he's put on the trial and treated like he's some kind of hero. But let me ask you this. The decision today was completely hypocritical based on what Bereitzer said about the U.S. prison system. And I don't think this maximum security prison infested with COVID, filled with, mafia figures and hardened violent criminals is that much better than a U.S. Supermax, as horrible as the Florence, Colorado facility or Terre Haute is, the ones you mentioned, which, by the way, was like a mostly Muslim prison for a while, Terre Haute, Indiana. So it's hypocritical. It's contradictory for her to keep him in there indefinitely. And what I said, I'm getting a freaking citywide curfew alert on my phone. I was about to read off it, but we're going to talk about that in a second. Mayor Bowser from Super Mario just issued a 6 p.m. curfew. Let me read this to you. Stratfor email on Assange's arrest. This is from the Stratfor leaks, which Wikipedia produced. And, anyone can weigh on this. WikiLeaks. I always call it Wikipedia, which is like the exact opposite of WikiLeaks. And shout out to Philip Cross, who's edited 40% of my page to make me look like some kind of like Russian Cuban spy. Stratfor email on Assange's arrest, 2010. Pile on, move him from country to country to face various charges for the next 25 years, but seize everything he and his family own, to include every person linked to WikiLeaks. Now, let me read you what Mike Pompeo said in his first speech as CIA director. His first speech as CIA director, April 2017, after the Vault 7 leaks, was all about the campaign to destroy Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And he said, he called for long-term countermeasures. We have to recognize that we can no longer allow Assange and his colleagues the latitude to use free speech values against us. So free speech is off the table. To give them the space to crush us with misappropriated secrets is a perversion of what our great Constitution stands for. It ends now. And then he said, while the CIA is legally prohibited from spying on people in the U.S., well, he was going to proceed to spy on Americans in the embassy in London who met with Assange. So I saw the decision today as an extension of those sentiments, which is keep Assange in jail as long as possible, destroy him physically and psychologically, keep him away from WikiLeaks, keep WikiLeaks pinned down on this case, and destroy what was truly an intelligence service for the people while building up, this phony apparatus of counter WikiLeaks organizations like Bellingcat. What do you think about that?
So the thing that I've been saying is, I think you're exactly right, because why wouldn't you want Assange to walk free? Why would you be okay with denying the extradition decision, but also wish to deny him the opportunity to exit Belmarsh prison? And the reason prison today, he would have at some point been able to make a statement, and we would have heard Julian Assange's voice for the first time in, I think, more than 2 years, because I think he was actually censored and silenced toward the end of 2018 while he was in the Ecuador embassy. And we weren't really hearing from him in the months prior to April 2019 when he was expelled and arrested outside of the Ecuador embassy, or dragged out of the Ecuador embassy. And so he would have made a statement. He would have said something. And perhaps it would have only been thank you to his supporters. But there would have been a power in seeing Julian Assange face a camera and speak to people and show us that he was alive and that he still had his spirit, and they had not been able to totally destroy him while he has been in Belmarsh for the last few years. And also the cumulative, right now, he's been going through arbitrary detention for a decade. For more than a decade now, he's been suffering conditions of arbitrary detention. And so the reason why you have to keep him in Belmarsh is to deny this journalist the ability to stand up for himself. And if he's on house arrest, he can potentially return to being part of the activities of WikiLeaks. He wouldn't be editor-in-chief. I don't think Christian Harafson would relinquish that, but he can be a consultant, and he could be involved in looking at new sets of documents that are brought in potentially. And I mean, I suppose I could see his lawyers advising him against that, but he would definitely be able to be there in spirit, supporting WikiLeaks again, and behind the scenes working to ensure that WikiLeaks continues to be an effective media organization. And so that is exactly why I believe Vanessa Baraitser had to keep Julian Assange in prison. And I think that is why the goal of freeing Assange can't just be to return him to his family and his 2 children. It also has to be to support the return of WikiLeaks and the return of Julian Assange. I mean, he doesn't have to be editor-in-chief again, but we want Julian Assange to be back and be involved in WikiLeaks once more. And I think that's going to be the evidence that he has prevailed against the United States government. When Julian Assange can be a part of WikiLeaks' publications once again, when he can present them, when he can speak on them, when he can do the kinds of press conferences that he did in 2010, when he was showing us the collateral murder video, when he was presenting the war logs, when he was uncovering 15,000 civilian deaths in Iraq that were previously unknown, when he was talking about execution squads or death squads in Afghanistan that were that existed. That was when he had his power, when he was able to partner with these media organizations and methodically deploy cables in a way that had a highly targeted impact in those countries. That was when he was effective. And I think that's exactly what the United States wants to prevent. And that is exactly why Vanessa Baraitser kept him in prison. She is serving people within the institutions in which she is captive, and decided to make a completely illogical decision. But it's okay, because I think bottom line here, another thing I'll throw out here, I think, at my final thoughts here, the sort of like final thing that I want to get out here is a lot of this all comes down to being about Vanessa Baraitser. People look at this and they say this is about Julian Assange. But I think that the other way we could look at this is that here is a very egotistical judge who sees this about herself. And she did not want to be responsible for sending Julian Assange to a U.S. prison and then finding that Julian Assange killed himself, and that was going to be attached to her name for the rest of her judicial career. So what do? You punt it. You decide that you're going to deny the extradition request knowing the U.S. will appeal. It goes to the High Court of Justice. There's going to be a panel of 3 judges that review this. And she said this today. It was incredible. She's sitting in this courtroom and she tells the defense that the prosecution, the U.S. government, has a right to appeal her decision. I don't know any self-respecting judge ever who won't stand up for their own decision. She sits there and she says, you have a right to go appeal your decision to the higher court. And until that happens, Julian Assange, you have not won your case, so you are staying in Belmarsh prison. In addition to criminalizing him for helping Edward Snowden leave Hong Kong and try to get to Ecuador and obtain asylum, that factored into her decision. But, basically she's saying this isn't over. The U.S. government has an appeal. And until that's over, you're going to stay in Belmarsh prison. And what's the game here? The High Court of Justice could overturn her extradition decision and she won't care, because her name won't be attached to it. And she won't be the one who's responsible if Julian Assange ends up killing himself in a supermax prison. And I think that's all she cares about. She just cares about making sure that she has no responsibility for whatever happens in Julian Assange's future.
That is such an on-point analysis, and I hadn't considered the part about Julian being able to speak today and what a threat his voice poses. He has been effectively silenced through the violence of the state. Thank you to Martin Rad. The revolution will be interwebbed. Don't know if that's the case. We have a few other chats I want to acknowledge, but I can't. David, Kyle, I think it's Kyle Murphy or Kyle, R. Tizzy. Thanks to everyone for supporting what we're doing, and definitely support Kevin at Shadowproof and the work he's doing. He's one of the few reporters who held it down nonstop on the trial of Julian Assange, is continuing to hold it down. Viva la información. You wore that on a shirt when you were 15 years old or something, like a long time ago.
I don't know. Yeah,
that was the WikiLeaks slogan, and you
and just to, oh, go ahead.
Well, anyway, can we bring, I want to bring in Aaron Maté. Can we bring in Aaron and start switching the pitch up a little bit to, there he is.
Hey, Aaron, how's it
Hey.
going?
Hey guys, can you hear
Aaron's
me?
lounging.
Well, I'm going to take off here because I have to go, but I just wanted to make sure that your viewers knew, Max, Ben, and hey, Aaron, that we don't have a date for the appeal proceedings for Assange yet. But, obviously I'm going to follow this at every stage and make sure that whether this goes to we don't know if Biden's Justice Department is going to do something unusual and decide to abandon the case and not put resources toward this. Zachary Terwilliger at the Justice Department made some really bizarre statement about how there might not be energy and resources at the Justice Department for this case. I don't know how to interpret that. I don't know if it's that significant, but the defense team for Julian Assange thought it was worth raising today. But anyways, I'm going to follow the appeal, and I thank you again for having me on the show.
Thanks for all the work you're doing, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, Kevin. Invaluable work.
Thank you to Kyle Jones and MCVS. Thanks for supporting. Welcome, Aaron.
Yeah, I want to acknowledge another really good comment by Richard Spence here, and that's
Not Richard Spencer.
Yeah, not Richard Spencer. No good words are said here by Richard Spencer, but Richard Spence wrote, "Did you think that it was the popular movement to free Assange that resulted in the ruling?" And, I think, as Kevin said, that there were a lot of political reasons, there were personal reasons, there were professional reasons for the decision, but I definitely think the international movement demanding the freedom of Assange, also the United Nations played a role. We saw Nils Melzer, the UN Special Rapporteur, their top expert on torture, has published many reports and done many interviews stressing that Assange has been tortured and should not be extradited. So yeah, I think we shouldn't underestimate the grassroots pressure and the international pressure in this decision as well.
And we're getting a lot of comments about the sexiness of Aaron and Ben. So I just wanted to comment that, I think everyone looks a lot better here than they do on the flyer that Ben made for this, where we look like a lineup, like a police lineup of child molesters, plus Anya, who looked really like pained or something, like she was really upset at the way we looked. So we have to get better headshots together. Anyway, Aaron,
I'll work on that.
Yeah. And Aaron, what's on your mind?
Well, Max, I'd love to hear what you witnessed today. I think it's really appropriate that we started off talking about Julian Assange because Assange has documented around the world
There we are.
mob violence and acts of terror that the U.S. does to countries around the world. So it was fitting today to see this in the heart of the empire, sort of the chickens coming home to roost in a way. And
Absolutely.
and of course, just the importance of the Assange story and the fact that so few outlets are giving it the respect that it deserves. And Kevin is one of these people who's like almost single-handedly in the U.S. kept the story alive and kept people informed. So yeah. I'm really glad that
thanks to the Intercept, which refused to allow him to contribute reporting from Old Bailey.
That's right. They did not enlist his services, which is one of many bad decisions we can say about the Intercept. But listen, Max, so I'd love to hear, you wrote the book Republican Gomorrah, which very early on warned about the far right direction that the Republican Party was going in. Today, I thought was the apotheosis of that. I just want to hear about what you witnessed today at the Capitol and your thoughts.
Well, yeah, I don't know if what I saw was anything like what I witnessed while covering the Christian right and their support for George W. Bush, someone everyone hates who went out to the Capitol today. I mean, I'll just tell you what I saw with as little opinion as possible. And then we can get into what I think of what took place. And Anya has some thoughts as well. And I think we can talk about the parallels in the way that this is understood to the way that Venezuela and Ukraine and other targets of U.S. regime change are understood. But what I saw, I went out there because, I mean, this is my city. I grew up here. I now live like 15 minutes from the Capitol. And I just went up there, not totally knowing what to expect. And I've never seen anything like this. It was totally remarkable. When I got up there, they had just entered these, there were about, 10, 15,000 people in front of the Capitol. And I didn't even bother with them. I went to the back of the Capitol where protesters had basically broke in and they had gone into the offices of members of Congress. And as I approached the door, there was Capitol Police, pepper spraying people, and a guy runs out with his hand covered in blood. And he said, they shot her in the neck. And I just started asking people what happened. And all these people are crying, running out. And they say they shot her. And a young woman had been shot in the neck, apparently with live bullets. And for whatever reason, I was trying to maybe tweet out the video of it. I walked down the Capitol steps, walked to the side of the Capitol. And for whatever reason, I happened to be right in the path of a stretcher coming out with a young woman. They're pumping her heart, trying to keep her alive. Blood is pouring off of the stretcher. Ben, you can even show some video of this that I tried to film, and I follow them. As I tried to film her to show her lethal injury, she was killed. Police officer with an automatic weapon pushes me back. So this leads to calls for revenge. People are like chanting "fuck the police," which is what, you would normally hear "fuck 12" at a BLM rally. People are calling the police traitors. Like, we thought you were on our side. And this, just leads to a massive escalation, where basically it took hours before the riot police even showed up. And what was behind that? Well, I think that the police and the Proud Boys had always just kind of gotten along for the most part, and the police treated them with kid gloves. And so they left it up to the Capitol Police. And I don't know what happened. I don't want to jump the gun, but it seems like a cop got frightened. And I actually found some cops who were trapped in the Capitol basement later on, who were afraid to even come out and were involved in some kind of hostage negotiation with the crowd outside. And the Capitol Police just got jumpy. I had heard from someone who witnessed it that the woman was with a group that was trying to break down Mitch McConnell's door. And she was killed. Back the blue. That's what they always chanted, back the blue. But then I saw these open confrontations with the police where people were just openly hectoring cops, condemning them. And I went around trying to ask people, well, why can't you understand why people would protest police brutality in this city? Like, in my own neighborhood, a young man named Dion K was killed for simply possessing a unregistered handgun. And all these people are for gun rights. He was shot in the back by a jump out cop from MPD while running away. And they could not give me a coherent answer. But some people would start saying, well, I totally understand that. And I'm not totally against BLM doing that. And then someone would jump in and start cutting in and saying, that's ridiculous. What are you saying? So, but basically there was just a lot of political incoherence, just complete anger there at the government. The anger really was just about the whole system and Congress itself. It wasn't necessarily about the election at certain points. And people by the end were saying, this is beyond Trump. Trump is even betraying us. And some of the diehard Trumpers were trying to come out and calm people down. Getting close to 6:00, I went back to the front of the Capitol where most of the crowd was, and the police began tear gassing them, hitting them with flashbangs. It was completely remarkable to see that at the end of the Trump era, police defending the Capitol with force against a pro-Trump mob. And there's a lot to say about that, but those are some of the scenes that I witnessed today.
Do we know who shot this woman who died? Because there were reports, and it's documented that at least some of these Proud Boys even shot inside the Capitol after they got in.
Yeah, I can't confirm, but everyone was saying Capitol Police. So I'm just saying what I was told.
Right.
It would make sense. I saw there was video of a cop with his weapon right after she was shot. For all I know, I wouldn't be surprised if there was an attempt to kind of run interference for the police and create all of these alternative scenarios, as they do with young Black men who were killed. And I would not support that. I'm actually a little bit, I want to know what happened. If the Proud Boys were shooting at cops and the cops responded, well, yeah, then there's a scenario, but there's a scenario that would explain it, but didn't some member of Congress go on TV and say there must be a justification for shooting her?
Yeah, I was watching C-SPAN, and I forget the name of the congressperson, but they were a Democrat from Texas who basically just said, oh, if the cops acted, there had to have been a reason. And I mean, they were storming the Capitol. So by that logic, I don't know if he's saying that they should have all been gunned down, but I don't personally take that position. I think that would have caused a disaster. And you hear a lot of people saying online right now, like, oh, we would have been gunned down if we tried that. But I think what was demonstrated today is that it's really unfortunate that it's these crazy right wingers who are taking the storm of the people's house, the Congress. I saw a lot of people,
Storming the Bastille.
yeah, exactly, a lot of Congress people and of the commenters I saw on C-SPAN were just shocked that something like this could ever happen, that that average people or people that weren't in government could storm this Capitol building. This is something we could have never imagined. Well, I think this is honestly just the beginning. And if the right can do it, imagine if there was actually a movement for something with concrete demands like healthcare, or I mean, that's what I think right now we need, is some sort of occupation of the Capitol. And that's how I would see like something such as force the vote being more successful, is if people were able to move in massive amounts and claim that space. I mean, it's insane to watch these images of people sitting in Nancy Pelosi's desk or standing at the speaker's chair in the House of Representatives, standing in the Capitol, these powerful places. It was a startling image, and I think it's valuable for the people of this country to see that something like that can even happen here. And then there was certainly a cathartic element, I think, for different friends that I have from around the world who were saying, I mean, everybody said it on Twitter, that this is something that the United States encourages in other capitals, but now it's coming home. As Aaron said, chicken's coming home to roost. But I mean, imagine if we had a massive movement with concrete demands storming the Capitol. Maybe things could turn out a little differently.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not calling for anything in particular, but why is it that, I mean, this is counter-revolutionary energy on the right, but and this was not a revolution, although they were calling for revolution explicitly. What passes for the left in the US is so scared of anything that remotely relates to revolutionary talk, and they're so wedded to the system that is failing everyone, that it's so hard to imagine anything like this. And their response to this is pathetic. And when I was there, I managed to talk to a lot of people there were just some people who were just so far gone in their right-wing ideology that there was no speaking to them. It was just like Trump 2016, the professional activists, the racists, the white supremacists. And there were so many young people who were just lost, confused, lone wolf type guys who finally, for the first time in their lives, were tear gassed. And for the first time in their lives, saw the cops gun someone down, assuming the cops did that. I'm going to take that back if the cops didn't do it. And to actually engage them on those questions, they didn't have answers. I would say, do you still back the blue? Some of them would say, I haven't backed the blue in a long time, meaning I don't support the cops anymore. Some of them were just so upset at the cops. But why is it that these people are pitted against the other group that's protesting the police and supposedly protesting the system, and they demonize one another? Well, I mean, it's obvious. And I would even ask people that, and they'd say, it's the media. And I'd say, yes, it's the media. But then they would start demonizing Antifa or BLM or however they understood the left as China, Chi-Com, Chi-Nazi, Chinese controlled communists. The brainwashing power was so extreme. But Anya's right. This is just the beginning. The Biden era is going to be an absolute disaster. And I've never seen anything like this, but I assume we're going to see something like this again. And all of those liberals who have, it's obviously not their fault that any of this happened necessarily, but all of those liberals on Capitol Hill who have those hate has no home here signs on their lawns, who say that they're part of this resistance, who've been waiting for Vindman or whoever to impeach Trump. I didn't see any of them out today. None of them pushed back against this. And none of them held up a mirror to it. None of them even came out with their phones and asked tough questions. None of them came out to have conversations with people that were critical. Nothing. They just hid. So what they call hate came home, and they stayed home. So there's absolutely, and the police handled, as I said, the police handled them with kid gloves. This is going to happen again. And then you see the force the vote conversation, all these opportunistic, fake.
We're going to talk more about that with Danny. So you might want to.
Yeah, but okay, I'll say my comment, but I want to make this point. They are scared of even putting pressure on progressive representatives. They're just scared of even like putting internet pressure on. These are people who stormed the offices of representatives. I covered the Tea Party for years, Aaron. They have been doing this for years. They have been scaring the hell out of the Republicans, and especially the rhinos, the Republicans in name only, in order to get their agenda across. And it's been working. They've moved the Republican Party towards their agenda. Who's moving the Democrats? A bunch of corporate lobbyists who break into their offices. Lobbyists break into Democrat offices.
They don't need to break in. They're welcomed in their offices.
Oh yeah, and by the way, AOC,
chocolates
she
and
spent all
roses.
week accusing Jimmy Dore of being violent, and then this happened. Jimmy Dore didn't break into anyone's office, AOC.
No, I mean, I was gonna make the exact same point that you have so many people who call themselves socialists or democratic socialists because they want to separate themselves from the socialists everywhere else in the global South, but they call themselves socialists and they won't even criticize Nancy Pelosi. Well, I mean, let's be real. These insane Trumpists, I mean, I'm not endorsing this, but they are calling for Trump to execute Mike Pence. like these so-called democratic socialists won't even criticize the neoliberal leaders of the Democratic Party, while Trump's hardcore fans are calling for calling for firing squads to take out leaders of the Republican Party. I mean, it's just like what is going on? But I also want to acknowledge here a great comment. Thank you so much from Sadida26. I propose all of us going to Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Grayzone or patreon.com/ModerateRebels. It really does mean a lot. And I'll jump in. I'll add something to this conversation really quickly here because Max mentioned that there's been a lot of people on Twitter pointing out that the kind of far-right extremists right now in DC, basically, I mean, they're calling for a coup. It's explicitly what they're calling for. They have these kinds of same far-right extremists have bipartisan support in foreign nations when the U.S. government wants regime change. So Alex Rubenstein, a friend of ours, contributor to the Grayzone, he has this image here from Ukraine, and I mean, in Ukraine, the same kind of people we see. I mean, not everyone involved in these protests in DC is a Nazi, but in the Ukrainian protests, likewise, not everyone was a Nazi, but the muscle behind the 2014 coup in Ukraine, the really violent forces that, with the support of the United States and Western European countries, successfully overthrew the government, were these Nazi forces. And you can also point out, I mean, in Syria, in Libya, in so many countries, I mean, it's these far-right extremist forces are the muscle behind coups. In Bolivia, it was these kind of fascist shock troops that we see now that the U.S. supported. So, I'm not in any way justifying what they're doing, but, you can't help but point out the kind of ironic, poetic justice that the Democrats have supported these same, I mean, and the Republicans, it goes without saying, but the Democrats as well have supported these same far-right forces when their official enemy countries in Hong Kong and Nicaragua and Venezuela. And this is what it looks like at home, unfortunately. It should cause for introspection.
Sorry, Anya, go ahead.
I just wanted to jump in super quickly to read a statement for the Venezuelan government actually released. It's on my Twitter, Ben, if you want to pull it up. But they actually said, this is from the foreign ministry, with this unfortunate episode, the U.S. suffers that which it generates in other countries with its policy of aggression. Venezuela hopes that the American people can forge a new path towards stability and social justice.
Well, I love this line here. I have it up. It's in Spanish, but this is Jorge Orreaza, who's the foreign minister, and he says that Venezuela condemns the political polarization in the people of the United States, which is so funny because if you listen to U.S. rhetoric or read mainstream corporate media outlets, they often condemn the political polarization in Venezuela, as if Venezuela is a uniquely polarized country. Masterful trolling. A+.
The point I wanted to stress is that today is a reminder that we are a failed state. We don't provide for people's basic needs. There's a long history of unaddressed racism and white supremacy. We spend, trillions of dollars colonizing countries around the world, and that has huge impacts, not just on those countries, but on this country as well, with the people that are sent off to die and are traumatized by the acts they carry out in foreign wars. And so on the right, you've seen Trump channel all this into this incoherent rage and racism like we saw today and have seen many times. But then on the liberal side, all the energy is spent basically trying to neutralize any type of effective response. And the main manifestation of that throughout the Trump era has been to blame everything about Trump on Russia instead of looking at systemic dysfunction in this country and the failures of the neoliberals that gave us Trump. And what was amazing on a day like today, when Trump really is responsible for what happened today. He incited all this with his insane, deranged election fraud stunt. He encouraged people to come. Even when they started getting violent, it took a long time for him to put out a statement. And even when he did, he still talked about how much he loves everybody. So today was a perfect day to point out just how unhinged Trump is. But Democrats couldn't resist doubling down on the Russia mania. So I put out a tweet of some of it, Ben. I don't know if you have it, but Ben Rhodes, Obama's foreign policy whiz, he says this is the day that Vladimir Putin has waited for since he had to leave East Germany as a young KGB officer at the end of the Cold War. Then there is Robert Reich, former labor secretary, principled person, good progressive. He's done some very admirable things. Putin won, he says. Greg Miller of the Washington Post, Putin, forever scarred by humiliating scenes of the Soviet Union's collapse, must see what is happening in the U.S. Capitol today as utter triumph. And finally, Joyce Vance of MSNBC, of course, today is a good day for Vladimir Putin. So even at this moment where politically, from a point of view of like narrow political calculations, you can do a lot here to just expose how incredibly insane and deranged Trump and the Republican Party is. Democrats still can't resist because they're so attached to this self-comforting and also imperial narrative that they still have to make it about Vladimir Putin. Like every time I'm still shocked by it, even though of course I shouldn't be.
Yeah, and there's another classic one right here that I'm going to get up from Michael McFaul, who is former U.S. ambassador to Russia.
McPhail.
This is also a guy. Yeah, Michael McPhail. Keep in mind, this guy is portrayed as an intellectual. He teaches at Stanford University. He also writes for the Washington Post. Trump today delivered his latest, but hopefully his last gift to Putin. No president in the history of the U.S. has ever done so much damage. That's all they can say at this point. It's just like it's like the record was already skipping years ago, and then the record just like flew off and decapitated someone. It's just so comical and ridiculous at this point.
Michael McFaul blocked me on Twitter 2 years ago for calling him Ambassador McPhail because he said he tolerates a lot, but he doesn't tolerate name calling. But
he cheered. Remember when Evo fled Bolivia and he said, "Great, this is great, great news."
Yep.
So he'll tolerate fascist military coups abroad, but won't tolerate being called McPhail.
Yeah, and thinks they're bad when it's in Washington, D.C. Getting back to what Aaron said about being a failed state, it's honestly, we were just in Venezuela and people were asking us, like, why aren't the people of the United States rising up more? Like, what is it going to take for you guys to pressure some change or force some change from your government and in your government? And honestly, after this COVID experience, people should be storming the Capitol. It shouldn't be to keep Trump in power, because that's really the sad thing, is you hear all these people out there today, and I heard them on Max's stream and on C-SPAN saying that they were there for Trump because Trump, he spoke to their needs and he kept his promises. I don't know what promises he kept to them or what. I mean, these people are definitely brainwashed, but say what you want about Trump, he does have this base of people that were willing to go out there and do this for him. I just wish that someone on the left, someone who represented not a border wall and increased militarization, but someone who represented access to housing and healthcare and education would do the same thing and say, look, this is the people's house. This is your city, your government. I have to go up against a lot within the Congress to defeat the corporate agenda and actually get things like healthcare and housing put on the table. But help me show up, like make Nancy Pelosi scared and actually force not just a symbolic vote, but an actual passing of legislation, or, I mean, chase them out, replace them with actual people in the government. I just think people should be storming the Capitol, and that there should be clear demands. There should be an agenda, and that there's going to be more of this kind of opportunity under the future Biden administration, if the first weeks leading into it are any signal.
Yeah, I tweeted earlier, this reporter Adam Serwer from MSNBC, who's like, the quintessential kind of liberal intelligentsia guy, wrote, "If they get away with this, it will be worse next time. I promise you." And I tweeted, well, how many liberal Biden voters who live blocks away with "hate has no home here" signs on their neatly tended laws came out to confront Stop the Steal? Absolutely none that I saw. And I'm getting ratioed by like resistance liberals. Ben, you're quick, man. And by the way, everybody hit the like button so the algorithm doesn't take us out. That really helps. Yeah.
Hit the like button on YouTube, he means. Like the thumbs up on YouTube.
Yeah, the thumbs up on YouTube. You can look at all of the responses from blue check marks. People are really mad at me. They're like furious that I said this. They're furious. Yeah, you would have called them deep state crisis actors. Like, no, actually, like I think it would have, they want to defend the Capitol. Like, there are members of Congress in there who had to be evacuated. Why didn't they come out and like defend these people that they worship? Why didn't they come out and defend the process? They just created the context for this to happen again. And there are so many more of them than there were of these right wingers. So they just like, it shows how like they always call the manager. They're the ultimate Karens. They always call on the authorities, and they themselves sit home and do nothing. They've been turned into spectators, and they don't actually believe anything can change. So they've created this cult of celebrity around various liberal figures. Maybe it's AOC, maybe it's Anthony Fauci, but they sort of seek to live vicariously through them and want these symbolic displays, but none of them do anything. I didn't even see them out there like filming or critically engaging with people. One guy came out and critically engaged with people, and he was left alone, and he almost got physically attacked. But if there were many more people, maybe even if they just had their own counter protest, honestly, like there were buses that had to pull up to evacuate members of Congress with DC police. And if a pro-Trump mob had wanted to attack members of Congress, they could have easily gotten away with that. And there was no one out there from the other side to defend what they claim to believe in. Like, I don't understand why my take is so offensive.
Well, Max, let me ask you, you covered the Black Lives Matter protests back in the summer in DC. How does the police presence compare from then to today?
Well, I said before, the police presence was not what you would have expected from a Black Lives Matter protest based on the June 1st rally last year against the basically murder of George Floyd on camera, which I was at. They brought Black Hawk helicopters, National Guard Black Hawk helicopters. They had members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff out on the street calling for, dominating the battle space. Donald Trump was, obviously one of the most iconic scenes of his presidency, him holding a Bible in front of the church at Lafayette Square Park, and tear gassing protesters in order for him to do that photo op. And the police tear gassed the protesters. That was the Park Police. They do SWAT. They actually did a no-knock raid a few years ago on my street for like handguns, and they had a helicopter over our house. So they, they're used to treating poor Black people like this and people who come out for poor Black people. Then they brought out the National Guard. Today, I watched the police, the first, round of reinforcements come in, and they did not have beanbag rounds. They did not have tear gas. They did not have shields. They just had batons, and they had like body armor. And it took about an hour and a half for them to bring in the real riot squad. And it looked like sheriffs and some members of the National Guard. And they weren't prepared for this. And I think it was ideological, I have to assume, because the police and the Proud Boys have this quiet relationship under the table. And the Proud Boys they chant back the blue. They salute the police. I saw them fraternizing with protesters behind the Capitol, like just acting like they were pals. And I think that's why this was able to take place. It was also able to take place because the right wing doesn't give a fuck. They don't ratio people for saying you should be out in the streets.
Yeah, so I guess that's my point. Like, I don't fault liberals for not confronting the Proud Boys. I think that for me, the main takeaway from today in terms of the police is that, like, how is it that you're sending in this, brigade to confront Black Lives Matter protests, but in the face of this organized, heavily white supremacist protest, it was so lax, and you let like a couple of thousand Capitol Hill police officers there to defend against a huge mob that they knew was coming at the encouragement of the president. I mean, that is like, and
I fault them. I fault them because we know what the police are about. So I fault them. And they say that, Black Lives Matter and all this, but they don't come out and do anything. They leave it to the police who shoot Black people. So I definitely fault those liberals, and they're ratioing me, and there's no coherent argument in that thread.
Trump started his presidency with his law and order inauguration address. I just think it says a lot that this is how it ends. And then also, I don't know what people think about the fact that Trump gave this big speech and ordered his supporters to go down to the Capitol, but then the minute things got out of hand, he tweeted to say, like, obey the police, we are the law and order crowd. If that you heard people actually saying they felt like Trump had abandoned them after he did that.
Yes. I mean, people were saying this is beyond Trump, and obviously they were saying Mike Pence was controlled by China.
And here's where, seeing all these people, they've all fallen for Trump's deranged conspiracy theories, the thing about the Dominion voting machines, and Venezuelan, like Venezuela being involved in the rigging of the election and Chinese money and all this stuff. And, everyone is condemning it, and it's fine. It's good to condemn it. But then I have to think about, and I have to wonder to what extent this plays into people's outrage. Is like, if you're someone who voted for Trump, and then you saw for 4 years Democrats blame Russia for it and actually say that Trump was a Russian agent. And you had someone like Adam Schiff literally read the Steele dossier into the congressional record. Literally, he like all these crazy claims in the Steele dossier about like Carter Page getting bribed with, or making a bribe arrangement with a Russian oil giant to lift sanctions, and Michael Cohen visiting Prague. Adam Schiff read that into the congressional record, and there was even a sprawling special counsel investigation based on these wild conspiracy theories. So that was like the sort of liberal, elegant way of pursuing a very damaging conspiracy theory in a bid to undermine an election. But that's been so normalized, and instead, the only conspiracy theories that we make fun of are the ones that come on the Trump side, because they're said. I mean, they are so ludicrous and unhinged. So how can you not? But what I'm worried about is like this prevailing double standard, and the fact that since there will be no accountability at the elite level for Russiagate, how that will factor into further resentment from all these Trump folks who feel as if the system has been stacked against them. Like, the refusal to account for the liberal conspiracy theory will only, compound the impact of Trump's conspiracy theories, as it looks like he's not going anywhere in terms of his like public brand. He's positioning himself to stick around, I think, for a long time.
I just think, the Russiagate narrative shows, and what we're seeing today with all those tweets. I mean, you look at Ben Rhodes' tweet, it's like, how is this not a joke? And like the dissonance that I'm experiencing when I say, why didn't people come out and defend the Capitol if you revere this place so much? It just shows how out of touch they are with everything that's going on in the country and how deeply invested they are in this system that's failed everyone. It's all about defending the system down to the State Department. And it's why the whole impeachment saga was geared not around anything Trump did at the border, for example, or corruption. It was geared around the most elite elements of the national security state. They defined that narrative. And their whole narrative is about defending a failed system. So whether we disagree with these right-wing mobs, who are just, some of the most brainwashed people I've ever encountered, and I've been, covering them for years, whether we disagree with that or not, they're responding to a complete systemic failure. Aaron, you were right that we are a failed state. And they're just whistling past the graveyard with Putin. It's just absolutely absurd. The sad thing is no one was talking about Russiagate or saying, oh yeah, this new Cold War they're trying to distract us with. They're trying to ramp up Chinagate. Their brains have been so hacked.
Yeah.
Their brains are so filled with COVID viral load that or it's like Chinagate viral load, that all they talked about was like, you are China, you are Chi-Com, like the cops are China, Congress is China, we are living in CCP controlled territory. That was, everywhere I went, people were saying that. So that's what's next. They're going to try to Chinagate Biden.
And to the point where they're even recycling Russiagate conspiracy theories. So just last week, the Trump White House put out this thing about how China is paying bounties to the Taliban to kill U.S. soldiers, which is like a carbon copy of what was tried against Trump this past summer when they said that Russia was doing the same, paying bounties to the Taliban to kill U.S. soldiers. And Trump is literally just copying that, erasing the country name with Russia and putting in China.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to have. That's going to be our next 4 years, Russiagate to Chinagate.
Thank you to Lucy Blue Eyes. Thank you to Steph. Should we not get into a habit of recounting, verifying our elections more? It could expose how shit our system is from primaries to general. Well, yeah, for sure. We could have systems like the one we observed in Bolivia where the counting is transparent. Jimmy Dore sent me here a few weeks ago. Thank you, David, and Jimmy Dore for sending David our way. Mila CH, thanks a lot for supporting. And I think we read these other ones. Yeah. Did I need to transition to what?
Well, I just wanted to jump in here and say that, the fact that we now see the Republicans, and especially the Trump Republicans, but in general, also neoconservative Republicans who claim to be never Trumpers, them pivoting to this Chinagate narrative, to me, it really encapsulates one of the fundamental problems with U.S. politics, and that's that aside from the mind-numbing bipartisanism where everything is fit, you cut off all of the edges and you just try to fit like a child tries to fit like a rectangle into like the star-shaped thing. They just like try to push it in to blame a foreign country. That's what U.S. politics is. That's the visual metaphor. So the Democrats have spent over 4 years blaming everything on Russia, and now we're going to see the next 4 years under Biden with everything blamed on China. And of course, this is part of the new Cold War, but it's also not new. The favorite U.S. political pastime is just scapegoating foreign boogeymen. That's why you can never address these domestic conflicts and the roots of them, because even people who claim to be on the left are just as guilty for scapegoating China, scapegoating. Look at the scapegoating of even poorer countries like Venezuela, which is insane. The Republicans, I remember, it was so funny during the uprising against state violence and racism and police brutality, we saw that there were not only members of the right-wing Venezuelan opposition, but actually sitting members of the Republican Party who were blaming Venezuela, this country that is under a medieval U.S. blockade, as if they have the resources to just launch an uprising in the United States. It just shows that, I mean, there's an element of utility in that, but also a lot of these Americans actually believe that. It's truly shocking. But I know we were talking about transitioning here, so Max, I'll give you the floor here.
Oh, well, I'm all for transitioning. But I think we're going to come back to this when we bring Danny Haiphong on in like a half hour. I think he's doing a live stream with Jackie Lookman, who's someone that everyone should follow, who's just got such a good grasp on revolutionary history.
Well, speaking of which, Danny actually just joined. If you want to bring him in now.
All right, yeah, bring Danny in. Hey, what's up, Danny?
Hey, what's going on, everyone? Hey.
How you doing?
Good. I'm good. Good to see all of you guys.
We were going to talk about, I mean, we had something, this to talk about the kind of a retrospective on the Trump era and the most absurd resistance moments, but I think we should keep it moving here. I mean, we've been talking about Stop the Steal, and Danny, you've had some very completely understated, subtle opinions on Force the Vote.
So maybe since we were just talking about it, if you want to give us your thoughts on the Stop the Steal mayhem we saw today before we get into Force the Vote, if you have any thoughts.
Well, I'm not an investigative journalist like you all who do such amazing work. So one of the questions I hope you guys can answer for me is, where's the money? I think that they're just like the Tea Party. I know, Max, you've done a lot of work on this. The Tea Party was backed by pretty powerful right-wing foundations. There's just a level of organization to this thing that seems to me very coordinated, and it's kind of been building over the course of this election. And so I'd really like to know more about that. But one of the things that just strikes me about this that isn't often talked about is, these forces were just able to walk right into Capitol Hill and kind of do whatever they wanted to do, and that's just something. I brought up the case of Miriam Carey in 2014, who was killed in D.C. for slightly moving onto to White House property in her car, was shot in the back 5 times, a Black woman, by the police, and killed. And she was pregnant, I believe, at the time. So, it just goes to show that there is this double standard, that there is this problem of race and racism that we really do still have to talk about. And I know some in our progressive movement don't really like to do that and see it as just like culture war stuff and all that. But I think this is really demonstrative of this, because if there were protesters outside demanding, let's say, Medicare for all, demanding defunding of the police, or community control of the police, anything that would benefit working people, Black people, etc., the response would be a lot different. There would not be any question about whether to get the National Guard out to disperse and to, weaken and get rid of this thing. So that's kind of my initial thoughts about this.
Well, that's what I've been saying is, the National Guard, they just waited till Muriel Bowser of Super Mario Brothers deployed them at 6 p.m. for her curfew. They were like so by the book. And I tweeted video of this. Like, there were cops literally held hostage in the Capitol basement. They were afraid to come out, and I watched them negotiating with these, the senior MAGA heads stepped in and tried to negotiate their release. And I mean, there's no way that would have been allowed to have happened with BLM, and there would have been national condemnation. Instead, we have like this Yeltsin-like speech from Biden, like, rah, rah, he's just not even there. No one actually knew what was really happening there.
Next, he's going to do a Pizza Hut commercial.
Yeah. Well, if he makes it there for the collapse of the US and take over by China, it'll be like a Chinese franchise or something. I don't know. But really, it was unfathomable that the police would have just mind blowing that the police were so on their back feet and so afraid. I saw them afraid on my way out. My phone had died and I was walking out, going to leave the premises of Capitol Hill. And there were these, douchebag Proud Boys behind me who just ran up in the faces of cops. And they said, "You fucking monkeys, you faggots, where were you when Black Lives Matter was tearing up the city?" Just screaming in their face. And I was like, of all my experiences with cops in DC, if I even talk back once, they will drag me into a cell. Obviously Black people don't even have like any latitude to do that. And they were just, it was unbelievable. As far as money, this was very grassroots on the one hand, but the media apparatus was plugged into Trump's MAGA system, and Trump led them to Capitol Hill. So it's really just the president of the United States and his Twitter account, which is about to be banned by Twitter, to answer your question. But Anya, brought up the point that while we don't agree with the agenda of these ultra nationalists, there isn't this kind of energy on the left to actually go and demand change. There isn't. What passes for the left in the US, there isn't the willingness to do this, to go up in the offices of people and say, "We're here. We're not leaving your office until you do what we want. You should be like afraid of the people because you are screwing us. You are systematically destroying us as humans." And that really relates to force the vote. So I don't know if you can bridge that, but that's something I really feel strongly about as well, is just the pathetic nature of the opposition to force the vote.
Danny, you're just joking about how before you came in that, you have all these people who claim to be on the left saying that mean tweets are literal violence, whereas we actually see these right-wing, the right-wing extremists, but they're actually doing, that's what literal violence is. It's not mean tweets.
No, and it's so relatable. We had so many people getting mad at Jimmy Dore. It blows my mind. Getting mad at him for, he gets angry, but he's angry because people are dying without health care. And he's also angry about wars and people dying elsewhere from US bombs. So when you have, the quote unquote squad and a lot of their supporters were coalescing to protect them from what really was just a simple and basic political demand. And it was all about civility. And there's a lot of this worship of civility on the Democratic Party side. And unfortunately, a lot of the left is an extension of the Democratic Party. And so there was really no questioning about, is this civility really going to work? It hasn't worked. There hasn't been a real, I don't know, some people say Overton shift to the left. We've been seeing with this moment shows that there is also an Overton shift to the right. And actually it has more force to it because first you have Donald Trump in the White House, but you also have this grassroots base, which has been energized. It has been, especially since the pandemic. And I know, Ben, you brought up, the scapegoating of China. That's done a lot of it as well. That can't be not included. But ever since Donald Trump has been in office, there has been this, and beforehand, there has been this currying of these forces. And the left has been focusing on different tactics, which are just not as effective in building to really forcing concessions from the state, if they're possible, which, I think that's the big question. Can you force concessions from a state that looks like this, that is controlled by these two corporate parties? Can you do it? We don't know because, we have millions of people supporting AOC and others, but they're not organized and mobilized to force that to happen. And then when there's an opportunity like force the vote to build that, because it wasn't that this was going to happen, like Medicare wasn't going to happen, but there was an opportunity to build up to that. And there was a lot of people, just the backlash was incredible to see, really singularly at Jimmy Dore. But what it was talking to all of us that if you demand certain things, then we're going to go after you based on X, Y, and Z, the home you buy. Yeah. Do you oppose war in Syria, etc.? Are you a Fed? Like Benjamin Dixon was calling him a Fed. I was just like, are you crazy, man? Calling people
Ben Dixon was calling him a Fed before he was invited on MSNBC.
Yeah. Calling him a Fed, like the consequences of doing that. just to
Yeah.
think about what actually that means to the long history of struggle for real left political change in the United States, with all of the very, especially those fighting against racism for centuries. What does it mean to be called a Fed? Um, it's a big deal. So I think that's where the connection is. It's the fact that we had a lot of this. Some people called it infighting, but really what I saw was it was a real backlash towards people who were demanding something pretty simple, pretty basic, and possibly something that could have, and I think did in some respects, but could have been more significant if it had bore fruits, of course. But um, could have just continued to build up people's confidence, which is what you really need in organizing. You need to build up people's confidence that they can win something. And there were a lot of people saying, no, 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 we don't want that. We just want more AOCs. We want more Elon Omars. And any demand on them is endangering this. And that's just a bankrupt model of change, in my opinion. I don't,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Before, during an earlier segment, I also mentioned that while we were in Venezuela, a huge theme among all of our friends, questions they were asking is like, when is the gringo revolution going to happen? When are you guys going to, as a movement for change, seize power in the United States? And what what I had to sadly keep explaining to them, I'm like, do you know that right now the left in the United States is arguing about whether or not they should force politicians to take a symbolic vote on Medicare for all, and that it's become super divisive, and like they can't even demand that from elected officials.
It's violence.
Yeah, it's violence to demand that. I mean, so it was kind of a teaching moment, I think, in that regard. But Danny, at least what I do believe about this moment and what it's revealed, it's that there might be certain gatekeepers who are really loud. They might have huge institutions such as the Young Turks, but I do think that Jimmy Dore and the people who spoke for Force the Vote actually represented the majority of people. And we saw that in the way that the petitions for Force the Vote blew up online. It's very common sense and that's why it's so frustrating to see these journalists, podcasters not prioritize Force the Vote or make it into some sort of argument, because millions of people around this country are suffering, and it's just basic for them, an obvious point that we should be demanding as intensely as we can, some sort of action on this on Capitol Hill. And so we saw 40,000 people sign on to the petition to force the vote within a few days. So there are these people out there, Danny, that I think we can forget about all the Twitter people who take up space. There are people out there, there are viewers, our viewers, Jimmy's viewers. Those people are real. They exist, and they're multiplying. There are thousands of them, tens of thousands of them, if not millions. And it seems like they're just waiting for a movement or a leader or something to direct them. So isn't that positive, at least? And the Biden administration, the next 4 years, can actually reveal a lot to these people in terms of that question you brought up, Danny, which is demanding change in this system even possible? And if not, what is to be done?
Well, Danny, actually, this is a really good segue. I just want to acknowledge a few of the super chat comments. I mean, we try to respond to all the comments. There's a lot of them, but especially we're grateful to Chunky U666. And they asked, I'm a pessimist, and I think we're all effed, but do you have any optimism for the future? And I actually think that's a good segue. I mean, just what Anya was asking about. And I also want to thank Victoria She. I want to thank Lucy Blue Eyes. Thank Keel Jones, who says, Max and Anya, you got to get Aaron to start smoking weed. But anyway, so thanks for all the comments. But getting back to this one, and also segueing off of what Anya asked, Danny, I mean, what gives you hope for optimism in the future, and what kind of change do you think we could see that Anya was referencing?
Yeah, no, I'm optimistic. I think that, with what Anya was saying, it was very, it's all very true. We do have a lot of people. I mean, it's not just, I think sometimes people take like just the polling numbers. Yeah, 70% of people, whatever, overall want Medicare for all. Republicans want it. Democrats want it, like 90%, all that. And they take that as just like, just that's it. But I think movements are much more, are about much more than that. Because not a lot of those folks, may not have hope for it. You know, do you think that is actually going to, no, that question isn't really asked, right? Do you think it can happen? Probably more people would say no, right? Right. And I think the positive is that you have so many folks who are on board for this. And, you know, I've had criticisms of the DSA. I know you guys, you know, have had criticisms of the DSA, especially on issues of war and peace. But when it comes to, you know, how much they've grown, and you do know that there are forces on the ground, even in an organization like that, they're doing work. They're doing work on the ground. But their leadership didn't go for this thing like force the vote. They didn't. They wholeheartedly either ignored it, or they were going after Jimmy Dore too, which is very, very weird.
Well, they also punted. Specifically, a DSA working group focused on medical workers was asked about it, and they just punted. They refused to take a position on it.
Yeah, and so, you know, it would be interesting to see what their membership think, because I've been part of several unions, and I know for a fact that oftentimes union leadership doesn't do things that a lot of the membership really wants. They'll sign on to contracts that nobody votes on, et cetera, et cetera. So this happens a lot, and
The
you know, a lot
auto
of it is-
worker union completely sold out the labor force and like let all their jobs be shipped overseas. So, I mean, yeah, they're
Exactly.
structured within the corporation in many
Yeah.
cases.
And when GE was, you know, the workers wanted to strike to build ventilators, the leadership was not about that either. So, you know, we have this crisis of leadership that's happening, and I think there is hope that there will be more you need that conflict, right? You need that conflict to continue to develop, and you need to nurture that so that the forces who are really in the majority, right? I do believe that most people who are in DSA want their leadership and want their principal organizers to pressure the folks that they spend so much time and money to elect to do the things that they said is on their agenda. And so I do think that there is more possibilities now to push that, and hopefully that will open up opportunities to do the things I know we all, you know, you all at the Grayzone do, I do, which is to bring in the stuff that Anya was talking about, like, hey, I'm in Venezuela and I'm talking to people and saying we can't get this from our government, and people look at you like, you know, you have two heads, and it's because, yeah, people around the world want this stuff too. They want peace. They want, you know, and that's where we can start to have a real peace movement too, because right now we don't have that either, and it's a big reason why we don't have all these other things too. So I think that's where the hope is that we can open more space. The more we can nurture that conflict, because it's absolutely fundamental. We're not gonna get anything if people who are elected with all of this support, and we have to acknowledge there is so much support. I mean, AOC is a very popular person, very popular, but all those folks, I mean, if they're not organized to make sure that stuff happens, or at least to make sure that some sort of event happens to show us what's real and what's not, then you risk more hopelessness, and we don't need that in a time where the right is moving. I mean, they're on the move, as we saw today.
Aaron, I want to ask you to weigh in on force the vote, because you know, you've been, I think you've had good relations with many of the people who were against it, and it became acrimonious. I mean, this was kind of like a pundit war in a lot of ways. And the pundits circled the wagons around AOC, the TYT pundits, and a lot of the people I consider opportunists, you know, people like David Pakman, who has like the personality of a filing cabinet. I don't know like why anyone watches him, but he was like attacking Jimmy Dore. And then you had like Nomiki Kant, this like, it was just like watching some like suburbanite in some long line in a department store have a meltdown or something. It was just insane. Like and then, you know, just calling everyone Assadists. It was just this crazy meltdown. Anna Kasparian, you know, I mean, we can go into that, all the personalities, but why do you think that they were so, I want to offer my analysis of why I think they opposed it so strongly. But why do you think they opposed it so strongly? And do you think this was sort of like a permanent rift in what passes for progressive media, whatever progressive means? I mean, the term progressive really was introduced as a stand-in for liberal when the word liberal became unpopular thanks to Republican attacks on Mike Dukakis. And it still means that. But I mean, is this a permanent, do you think there's like a permanent rift and that the contradictions have been exploded in left US media? And, you know, what was it like to kind of be a part of that rift? I don't know if I can articulate it properly, but I feel like this was more painful for you than it was for some of us.
Well, look, I want to start by acknowledging what I think is actually one legitimate critique of Jimmy, because I think there's actually one. I don't think his tone always is appropriate. I do think that he says stuff that is aggressive in an unnecessary way, and actually in a negative way, that it actually loses support. I think the point of a movement is to bring people in, and when he dismisses people for disagreeing with the tactic in the caustic way he does, I don't think that's good. And I think that there's a legit critique there. I think some people who support Medicare for all were turned off by his tone, and I don't fault everyone for that. Now, some people, of course, brought up his tone in a disingenuous way, and some people brought up a lot of other things about Jimmy, I think, in a very disingenuous way. I think the disingenuous aspects of the critique of Jimmy are two main things. One, there's this sycophantic atmosphere around especially AOC. I think a lot of media types really respect AOC and want to be her friend, and there's nothing wrong with respecting AOC, in my opinion. I think she ran for Congress. She defeated this like long-term corrupt incumbent, Crowley, and that's impressive. You know, I respect that, and she did that with Justice Democrats, and I don't think people should make light of that. But I think some media people have identified too much with her in this kind of like sycophantic way, and they equate any criticism of her with some kind of like being a traitor somehow, or possibly threatening their potential friendship with her. I think there's that kind of dynamic going on. And then there's also, I think, the fact that it's Jimmy who has been actually so right and so vindicated on issues where other progressives have been so wrong. And I'm thinking namely of Russiagate and imperialism, where Jimmy consistently called Russiagate out as bullshit from the start. And on places like Syria, he also helped expose the dirty war, or he challenged the propaganda used to justify the dirty war, including the chemical attack deceptions that we've been exposing at the Grayzone, especially with the OPCW whistleblower scandal. And I think that there is this subconscious, at least, imperative there where people don't want to let that kind of leftism, that consistent leftism, where you're not just a progressive inside US borders, but you also apply your progressive principles to other countries, and you resist US imperialism. I don't think people want to let that in and want to let that be legitimated by accepting the ideas of someone like Jimmy. That to me is my guess for what was driving all this. But I also don't want to, you know, and I people probably also in the chat will disagree with me here about Jimmy's son, but I do think that there is a critique of the way he's spoken that I think is fair. I do. I have to admit that.
I think just on that point, I think Trump and Jimmy and this phenomenon, I think people like that because people are pissed off. People are angry. They're just as upset as Jimmy is, or they were upset the way Trump is. And so I think that's actually what drives their base to some degree. And that's because people are angry. People don't have like the same thirst for respectability politics that I think a lot of people in media might. That's just my take on Jimmy's tone.
The left in the US there's a class issue there. And I can tell you, you know, having been around the Brooklyn left, and I grew up in like two sides of DC. I grew up in the upper middle class DC and went to private school. And I know those kind of Brooklyn left people. I was like raised with them, but I know the other side of DC and how real people actually talk. I know how people talk in the hood. I know how working class people talk in the far low rent suburbs. and they would relate much more to Jimmy Dore than the people. I know how it is. You have to learn how to talk to get like into the media and have these editorial meetings, and you basically are always dealing with different managers. The editors are basically the managers, and it's just a totally different mindset. And Jimmy comes and he says, fuck off, AOC. You're a traitor. He says that and just rapes people. It's not just people on the left, just people in general relate to it. Jimmy's like tapped into something so real in this country. I mean, go to like Rockford, Illinois, or go to like, La Plata, Maryland, or wherever, where people are like dying of opioids, getting put out of their homes. And that's the shit they relate to. What Jimmy shouldn't do, I'll openly say this, he shouldn't be acting like an alienating way to allies like Katie Halper. I mean, he should apologize for that, but on her show, he shouldn't do that. But beyond that, I totally support what he's doing. That's exactly what we need. And the reason that he's there is because Bernie just was so pathetic. I mean, after Iowa, they tried to steal Iowa from him with this phony shadow app, and he didn't stay there. He didn't challenge it in court. He didn't call out the protesters. He rolled over for Biden. He let Biden beat him and Russia bait him in a debate. And here's what happened. I'm going to toss this to Danny, but here's what I think happened with this battle over force to vote. AOC personally coordinated the attacks on Jimmy Dore. That's what I believe happened. And behind that, you had Democratic congressional leadership actually getting AOC to shut this down because it was such a threat to what they were trying to do, because it challenges the whole concept of this progressive wing sheepdogging all of these young people who are being betrayed and all of these left-wing millennials back into the Democratic Party. It's just scared them. It scared the hell out of them. And AOC, I know this for a fact. I know AOC was told by Pelosi and whoever else to shut this stuff down. And then it filters down to the Ben Dixons and everyone else who wants access to AOC. And you can see that access playing out at The Intercept with Ryan Grimm or Jeremy Scahill's softball interview with her, where they're not going to challenge her because she brings in the views, and she's pretty much all they have left after Glenn left. I mean, it's basically the Interslept. So they need AOC energy, and she's been created as this giant celebrity. And then for AOC personally, she was brought out of obscurity. AOC, she was not a movement figure. I mean, she says right at the end of every sentence, which you have to do if you're in the movement, right? So you have to do that, right? And she calls everyone
right.
Folks. You have to call everyone folks and say right at the end of the Proud Folks were out today, right? So
Right.
Anyway, but she was never a part of the BDS movement. She was never at anti-war rallies.
And she sold out. The Palestinians were the first people she sold out.
But even before,
Right.
she was never a part of anything. She was a bartender, and she's always like, yeah, like she was at some like dive bar or something with all of these like factory workers saddling up after a hard day, and then they have to like put their feet in buckets full of hot water because they were standing all day or something on the assembly line. No bullshit. She was at this bar called like I forget what it was called. It was on Union Square, and you have to have a headshot before you get hired at that bar. It's like an elite bar. That's as far one of the bars I think she worked at. But anyway, she comes into Congress completely unknown, uplifted by all these DSA people who live in the gentrifying sections of her district, which are pushing the Puerto Ricans out. And then she starts to make $170,000. She's a national celebrity on the cover of Vanity Fair, wearing $4,000 dresses, posing with Nancy Pelosi. She's important. And she starts to get cognitively captured by the establishment. And now she's presented by Jimmy Dore. He presents her with the basic contradiction, a fundamental contradiction of what she said before she was elected.
Which
when
is how she defeated Crowley and pulled off that victory.
Exactly.
Is by adopting this movement that she then refused to stand up for.
And saying, I will be a one-term congressperson and I'm going to disrupt business as usual because these people are screwing you. And that's why they voted for her. And then she refuses to do it. She won't do it because she doesn't want to give up all of what she has, which could possibly lead her to the Senate or even the presidency in her mind. And so that's what's been created for us. And then you have all these pundits acting as her lager, to use an Afrikaner South African term, circling the wagons around her to defend her, and just deploying the same access journalism that is part of the culture of the Beltway that we hate, that the DSA is supposed to hate. And they've all been dragged into the system on AOC's coattails. And that's why it's so important what Jimmy did. He succeeded. Force the Vote succeeded in exposing the squad. It succeeded. Anyone who says it's failed doesn't know how this works. And it succeeded because it's moving people towards organizations outside the Democratic Party, which will never produce material change. I'm 43. I just turned 43. It's never produced material change in my lifetime. I'm not going to live forever. So I'm eventually going to go in a different direction. And so should you.
Okay. I want to say a couple things. It was clear to me when AOC praised John McCain upon his passing and called him an unparalleled example of human service and dignity or something like that. It was clear to me then that she was not the person who I donated money to for her campaign, and I was excited about. That was obvious. I guess my question, though, for me is, how much do we want to make about this moment? Because the campaign for Medicare for All will go forward. Presumably, I assume Democrats are not going to fully, at least progressive Democrats will not fully abandon it. Although if they do, then I'll eat those words. And people like AOC are going to be important figures in that. So I guess my question is, do we want to cancel these people for making, I think, such a bad decision when it comes to force the vote? Or do we want to make our critiques, but I guess not rule them out completely as total sellouts and frauds? I mean, I just don't want to go that far, even though I don't agree with so much of what I hear AOC say now. And I don't think she's the...
Tossing to Danny, but Aaron, what would it take for you to rule them out? What would it take?
Well, I guess...
And, and Danny, follow up.
Well, first of all, there's one key point here that we've touched on, which is that, I mean, look, this got a lot of traction online, but this was a very spontaneous thing. And there wasn't a mass movement behind this. There was a lot of people online who supported it, but there wasn't the time put into organizing big rallies and working with organizers. And not every single organizer, I think, was co-opted by the squad here. So it's like, the question is, how much do we want to make out of this one moment?
The pandemic makes that difficult because the base of people who would be around, like the Trumpers are going to swarm the Capitol, but I don't think progressive or liberal people are going to do that right now because of the pandemic. But there were like tens of thousands of people who signed the petition for force the vote.
They'll always find a reason not to do anything. The progressives and liberals too. I mean, they're just afraid of everything. They're afraid of like human contact right now, but I feel like they're just playing out their essential psychology against the backdrop of COVID. That's like what they really want to be, is staying at home on their screens, like social distancing. Danny.
Yeah, my view is also that a lot of these progressives, really quickly, I'll just say, they're always like playing three-dimensional chess against themselves because they think they have to be so strategic. They think that politics is all about strategy. And I fundamentally agree with Max. I got to say, it's actually pretty funny. We had a commenter here. Max mentioned La Plata, Maryland, and I feel obligated to say, as someone, I went to middle school and 1 year of high school in La Plata, Maryland, actually, randomly. I don't even know if Max knows that. But when Max was saying that about Jimmy, I mean, I fundamentally agree that, I got up because as soon as Max started mentioning that, I started thinking of the classic 1976 movie Network, which I would highly recommend anyone who hasn't seen it. I mean, this guy, this main character, he has this famous speech on TV. I'm as mad as hell. I'm not going to take it anymore. It's a pretty brilliant movie that I think, it was really prescient for its time, explaining the kind of media takeover of American culture and politics. And I really think that, that movie from '76 explains this the same moment we're in right now, where there's just millions and millions of disaffected people who aren't even necessarily ideologically developed. They might not have some kind of coherent analysis of the problems in American society, but they're as mad as hell and aren't going to take it anymore. And people like Jimmy tap into that swell of energy, and then they get attacked. The base of people who are mad as hell and aren't going to take it anymore, they get attacked by these kinds of professional gatekeeping leftists who work at The Nation or whatever, like these respectable center-left, left-liberal publications, because the people who are mad don't have an articulated, developed ideology yet. And even though, of course, the media gatekeepers don't blame themselves, even though they're the ones largely responsible as the ideological gatekeepers, as the commentariat, they're the people who turn bourgeois ideology, they reify it into the masses of people and make it political. And what's incredible for me is that they never accept any of the blame. They always blame people. And it reminds me of the response in France to the yellow vests. It's true that the yellow vest movement was not entirely a left-wing movement, you could say, because there were a lot of working class people who did not have a coherent, developed ideology. But a lot of people on the French left and a lot of observers internationally on the professional left, instead they castigated, they criticized the protesters on the streets of France for not being perfect enough and not having the ideological development. So, I mean, I think that's one of the roles that we at the Grayzone can play, is help to encourage that, help to move people in a progressive direction, to understand the contradictions. But what's so incredible to me is that so many people in the professional media, their immediate response is just to demonize people like Dor, demonize his massive base of people. And there's also the element of jealousy because he has a much bigger audience than they do. Because at the end of the day, they actually don't like the masses of people. They think the masses of people are brutes and are stupid, and they just want to stay in their bubble. I mean, that's the reality that I learned from living in New York for 5 years. Even people who claim to be revolutionary socialists, they don't like the salt of the earth.
Yeah, well, wow. There's a lot to respond to here, but I think I do want to acknowledge, for one, I think everyone has their role, right? I think Jimmy Dore definitely plays his role very well, and I think the anger, as Max and everyone and Anya and Ben, you were saying, is very effective. Of course, if there are things, Aaron mentioned, Katie, how, of course, if we should all try to stay on the same side. So if there are like attacks on people who are really legitimately on our side, then we need to mend that. And that's where, sometimes I guess anger can kind of get loose, and it can hit folks that shouldn't be hit. But at the end of the day, for me, what is most disturbing about this moment, and I think it is, I'm in my next article next Wednesday, I'll be talking about this the attacks on Jimmy, what we're seeing. It eerily reminds me of how it felt to write for Black Agenda Report during the Obama period, and seeing how there was this coalescing of the entire left, or at least what called itself the left, from the most revolutionary, as you were saying, Ben, to the most liberal, in ensuring that no criticism could be had of Barack Obama himself. And Barack Obama is far to the right of someone like AOC, but I think we're seeing the same kind of system being put into place, this media system, and this sheepdogging of the activists, the attempted sheepdogging of the activists, into this way of thinking about politics, right? You elect the person who looks like you, who talks like you, and when they don't do the things that you want, you cannot criticize them because their existence is enough, right? They are a reflection of you, and that is enough. Representational politics, all of that. And I think that is happening to a large degree here. And that is where I think a lot of anger should be directed towards that. But I do think that there are so many folks who are who are kind of in this milieu, all of these millions of people. I mean, Bernie Sanders is the most popular politician. AOC is one of them as well. You got to find a way to reach them. And anger can be one of them, but there are a multitude of ways to reach people. So I think in that moment for Forced to Vote, that anger was very effective. But there's still a lot left to do, and I do think that out of this, what needs to be the focus is, how do we build these kind of independent institutions, these organizations that can support that kind of anger and move people in a way that isn't going to just allow them to be captured by the Democratic Party, because that's what this, I think, is all about at the end of the day. Is there is this capture of the left in the Democratic Party. It hasn't necessarily been broken just because AOC and Rashida Tlaib and these folks are now in it as well. That's not really how politics works in a society like ours, which is dominated and ruled by capital. And so you have to figure out ways to organize outside of that. And that's where I hope this goes. And so anyone, Nomaki, whatever her name is, and all these folks who are trying to pull us away from thinking about any of that, that's really what it's about. Calling people Assadists, they don't want to hear about imperialism, as Aaron was saying. They don't want to hear about it, because if you do, then you have to look outside of U.S. borders and things are happening there. You know, trillions of dollars are being spent to destroy entire countries, and they're being destroyed for a reason, right? To prevent the same things that we really want here in the United States, right? Peace, bread, a place to live, human rights, right? This so-called notion of human rights. That's what we want. That's what we're fighting for, and we're much more powerful when we're an international movement. So that's yeah, as Aaron was saying, where a lot of the ire towards Jimmy is too. Is he's one of the few in the so-called progressive media. I consider Jimmy on the left. I don't really put him in the same, like Pac-Man or all these folks. They don't touch these issues, right? A lot of these folks think like race is a culture war, and racism is not really a big thing. It's a distraction. All of this stuff, nonsense.
Well,
I mean,
Pac-Man
it's
also
nonsense.
insisted that Pac-Man claimed that the coup in Bolivia wasn't really a coup, and he said that Evo Morales was a dictator. So that says everything you need to
Awesome.
know about David Pac-Man.
Awesome. Yeah. And so for me, you know, I come from a different perspective. You know, sell out. I think for me, AOC, yeah, she rode upon a movement, but you know, for me institutionally, my litmus test is imperialism, and my litmus test is, you know, what do you do there? And I've seen very poor things in that regard with the entire squad in different areas. And so, you know, I wouldn't say sell. I would say this is politics. This is how the United States, this is how U.S. politics works. And the only way we're going to break out of that is by creating our own politics, right? We haven't done that independently yet as a left movement or grassroots movement. We're not there yet, but we need to get there. And I think, you know, one way you do that is finding all the ways you can to heighten these conflicts and contradictions in a way that's effective. And sometimes what you try out is not effective. Sometimes what you try is. And I think sometimes it's both. And here we saw a massive response to force the vote, but you also had not the results that I think a lot of people wanted. And now we're back to the drawing board. So I think that there's so many elements to this to really study and analyze to help us understand how to move forward. But none of that can happen if our focus and priority is how do we you know, how do we protect those who are supposed to be leading this movement, right? We if we're thinking about that, then primarily, then we are, you know, I think not going to take the risks that we need to take to move forward, right? We're not going to be those folks storming Capitol Hill, right? We won't get there, but yeah, so there's a lot here, and the whole time Max was talking, I was like, tell me what you really think.
We won't get there, as you said, Danny, if we're like falling for that shtick that the squad pulled, that ruse that they pulled of diversity washing the Democratic Party, like Obama. I don't, you know, it was very meaningful. Yes, it's meaningful that Ilhan Omar comes in wearing a hijab after so many years of post 9/11 Islamophobia. But you can't keep falling back on that after you cast your vote for one of the most heinous ultra Zionists to run the Democratic Party in Nancy Pelosi, who supports all the wars on the Muslim world in the Middle East. Who, I mean, I don't care about your blue hijab anymore. Stop hijab washing Nancy Pelosi. Stop diversity washing with the squad. It's not going to work anymore for a certain group of people who are sick of the wars, who are sick of imperialism, and they want you to throw down like you did on Elliot Abrams. And I bet you anything that after Ilhan Omar's display of contempt for Elliot Abrams, she was pulled back. And she's been much quieter about empire since then, when there is so much to say, including the possibility of a war on Iran. We don't hear them talking about that. I think the line was drawn here, and you know, Dan Cohen's video for Mint Press was so important in showing that these people who've been circling the wagons around AOC are the ones who've been making it so hard for us to make the case to the broader left that they need to oppose empire, that Aaron Maté is right about Russiagate. Every time Aaron makes a valid salient point about Russiagate, they will come in and say, you're supporting Trump. every time we say that Syria shouldn't be sanctioned to death, that they should be allowed to rebuild their homes so refugees can come home, they'll say you're an Assadist and you're being funded by the Assad regime, which is crazy. Like I don't even know how to do that if I wanted to do that. Every time. And so the line was finally drawn. They're on one side and we're on the other side. And I have as much in common with those people as I do with the, far right or whatever. I see them more just like, corporate Republicans. Like I have as much in common with them as them.
But Max, Max, look, I don't want to defend the Young Turks because the Young Turks to me is clownish in so many ways with their pathetic coverage of Russiagate, of any foreign war, of Julian Assange, of the coup in Venezuela. But at the same time, they've had you on when your book came out.
I don't care. That's nice of them, but I don't care. Don't have me on anymore because I want to tell the truth.
Okay,
I got the gray zone.
But the point is, they invited you on to speak, to tell your truth, and they weren't stepping forward to try to cancel you. So, like, what I'm saying is, you were just saying that every time we step forward and say something, they emerge. I don't think that's quite true. I think
they're not attacking maybe us personally, but they're making a case that undercuts everything we're saying, which is just based on facts and history and the journalism we do. They're just coming in and undercutting it and claiming that they're on the left. Honestly, I have more respect for like Democratic operatives who go on and out and run these like grim campaigns with Super Bowl ads against Republicans than I do for a bunch of synthetic left pundits who claim that they're socialists and wear socialist on their sleeve while they're attacking all of the targets of U.S. empire left and right. Like and sheepdogging for the Democratic Party. They're worse because they're insidious. And I just don't care anymore. I feel mortality. I feel maybe this is my midlife crisis. I don't have that much time here, and we need to tell the truth. We need to save people. We need to educate people. And so we need to tell them who the charlatans are and who the liars are who have been undercutting us nonstop. And we finally had an opportunity to do that in this moment. So I'm not going to hold back anymore. And Anya never held back. Anya, in what year was it? 2017 when AOC came into Congress with Danny, you all did a piece on RT. Our AOC is a progressive fraud. And at the time I was like, yeah, it's probably going to be true, but aren't you saying that a little too early?
I just, when she sold out the Palestinians, that just said it all for me. But then also she did like a fake protest against Nancy Pelosi. Her first time that she was sworn in, she did this same thing where she claimed she got a ton of attention for protesting Nancy Pelosi, but then she was actually standing outside of Nancy Pelosi's office saying that Nancy Pelosi comes from a grassroots background and she has so much respect for Nancy Pelosi, so she's encouraging Nancy Pelosi. I mean, it was just complete bogus. So yeah, I had Danny on to talk about why we kind of saw at that point that AOC, and I'm so glad that Danny just now also brought up, and I'm sure he did back when we talked then, this like Obamification of AOC, and Obama's role was to pull people into the Democratic Party who'd been lost and believed in something more left wing, and I see AOC just, that is her role. That is what she exists to do. That's what the squad exists to do. That's why they tweet out their little picture of their like little diverse clique and then go and vote for Nancy Pelosi. It's for people who are going to fall for some sort of propaganda without any action whatsoever behind it. And the fight for Medicare for all, I expected it under Obama. Like, Obama was elected with that mandate. He had control of the House and Senate and could have passed Medicare for all, and he didn't. And it's because the corporate Democratic Party never will, doesn't want to do it. And the same thing will happen now with Biden. There will be an excuse. Like, I just don't believe in this. We have to keep fighting. It's going to come. And like, we have to keep her on our side, because they're not going to do it. I mean, it gets back to the question that Danny brought up earlier. Is it possible in this system? And if not, Danny, what do we do? Because I mean, maybe we should be storming the Capitol.
Well, to me, I just want to say, to me, nothing is predetermined. And this is where I don't like so much focus on the squad, because they're a small group of people. Yeah, I mean, I think they lack courage. And I think that the Pelosi thing was an example of that. They had a good opportunity to leverage their vote for something. They got Cory Bush added to the oversight committee. I think that was it. That's all they got from what we know. And also the a vote on the repeal of PAYGO, which they say was important. But at the same time, you know, the squad, whether the squad does something good or not, nothing really matters unless there is a mass movement. And there isn't one yet. There isn't this huge organized left yet. And I
think they have the chance to spark that if they actually took action and started standing up to Pelosi. And I mean, like, if they were behaving like Trump did and said, like, come to the Capitol, do this, we need Medicare for all, there are people dying, it would piss Nancy Pelosi off, but it would spur that kind of movement.
they should be
They
encouraged.
don't want to do that.
They should be encouraged to do that, but I just don't think it stops and starts with them. Organizing can happen outside of
This Obama model of politics needs to be obliterated, and that's what they represent. And so this is one thing that needs to be done. We can talk about other things that need to be done, but this diversity washing of a pro-corporate, pro-Wall Street, pro-war, pro-austerity party with this small group of people whose only importance to that party and the power brokers who control their ambitions and their future is that they play an outsized role in washing the reality of the Democratic Party and misleading so many young people who would otherwise be with us and would otherwise go out and defend people in the streets who don't have healthcare, who are being thrown out of their homes. And so it's just delaying progress and crushing dissent with that Obama model. And that's why they need the focus that they get.
And they're
where
literally
here?
paid almost like
disagree?
$200,000 a year to do that job. Like, they are sent there to do this and nothing else. So I don't really have any sympathy for them. Like, they need to be drilled and pushed and attacked as much as possible. Like, they are living they live a very nice lifestyle. This is their job. And it's a matter of life and death for millions of people who don't have the luxury of, like, debating it the way that we do.
Okay. Where I disagree on one thing Max said about the Obama model. The Obama model, though, is not calling Elliot Abrams a war criminal. And that's what Ilhan Omar did. And it's also
They're
not
going to do it again.
Well, you don't know that. You don't know that. You don't know that.
Mark my words.
Okay.
Obama said a lot of radical things while he was running for president. It's like about what you do ultimately, and I don't think she gets like endless credit for making that
a House committee hearing, which I thought was important. And we'll see. Look,
and she votes for sanctions on China left and right. That's the real cause, that the real dividing point here. And she's on the side of the new Cold War on China. She's pushing that hysteria left and right.
And so, okay,
Aaron, finish and then I'll go after you. But finish, please.
Well, so the question is, I guess it's for me, it's about approach. Like, I just don't want to write these people off completely. Instead, they should be pressured, as Force the Vote was trying to do. And I'm not saying that should relent. I guess for me, it's just a question of the way we discuss them. And on that front, I want to say about Jimmy, I'm not tone policing Jimmy. I like Jimmy a lot. I watch the show every day. I find him very entertaining. He's called me swear words on the air when I advocated voting for Biden, which is a position I stand behind, because again, the alternative was Trump. And I thought Jimmy was short-sighted in kind of his contempt for the neoliberals, in forgetting that the alternative was reelecting Trump and his circle for another 4 years. But I'm just saying that people do voice objections to it, and we either can write them off completely or try to take that into consideration. And I think that the movement that I want to be a part of is something that is inclusive and doesn't rule out everybody, even if we have disagreements. Like, that's just going to happen. And there are certain baseline things like Medicare for all that everybody can unite around. And for it to be one, it's not going to be one just with our faction, with the Grayzone faction of the left. Like, there is going to have to be some partnership, even with people that we disagree with on many things. And I'm just worried about this one Force the Vote issue being made into something bigger than it actually is.
Well, yeah. Well, okay. Where should I jump up? For me, it's just, I think it's important to recognize that while the squad is small in power, they in number, and it's not, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that, we can conceive of the forward development of this movement being sparked by a real intense pressure campaign
When they speak about it, they have only encouraged it.
Yes.
They've only
they
encouraged
only
it.
encouraged. I mean, we've heard Elon Omar with the Uyghur situation, all of that. I study them on this stuff, and oftentimes it's very poor. And ideologically, that matters because they do have real power. They're influencing their base to coalesce around things that they should not be supporting. They should not be supporting any aspect of the war machine. I don't care what you think about China. I'm called a Wu Mao and an agent of the CCP. I don't care because I care more about peace and not a nuclear catastrophe between the United States and China in the South China Sea, for example. Like that for me takes precedent, and we need to figure out how do we build that kind of energy in this sort of mass movement that's being built around these forces like the squad. But it's not just the squad. The squad are a product of this mass movement. And so we need to figure out ways to raise the level of consciousness of these forces. And sometimes that does take being very direct and very clear about the lines in the sand that we have to draw on these very critical issues. Medicare for all, of course, is one of those, but you're not going to get Medicare for all if you're dropping bombs in Yemen or you're crafting legislation to sanction China, etc. You're not going to get it if they don't speak out for Julian Assange. And you have dozens of political prisoners in the United States. There are things that are being left out of the conversation intentionally through this development. And I do think that there is this Obamification of the squad that's been developing over the course of the years. Not to say that it's the same. It's not Obama and the squad are the same. It's that there is a larger strategy of the elite, of the Washington apparatus that is crafting this model around them to keep them relevant, but ensure that they are paralyzed and unable to do anything. I'm sure that they want to do these things, but once you're in and once you are surrounded by those forces, you're not going to do it without a real demand. And even when you do it, we get to that moment, as I said, nothing's predetermined, as you said, Aaron, but once you get to that moment, that's where the real education happens. That's how we radicalize, I think, this movement. And so it will take some, if not extreme amounts of energy, and some of that will be anger, but it's really about where are we moving that, where are we directing it, and we have to direct it in the right places. And I think that it's it's not an easy question, but I don't think it really is about writing people off or sellouts, etc. Some people like Jimmy may have individual opinions about that, but it's really about where are we directing that energy? Is it in the right place? Is it towards the right objectives? And is it challenging the right things? And I think that's where we have to take lessons from this moment going forward.
And I'll just say quickly, Ben, that Bernie supported the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. He supported the Iraq Liberation Act in 1998, authored by a bunch of neocons. His position on Israel was not that great, but it got better. And, he did some positive things. I know he caved in the campaign at the end, didn't really fight, but he still moved the conversation towards getting Medicare for all on the agenda. He played a huge role in that.
Obama did that in 2008. That was like a huge aspect of Obama's campaign in 2008, and why he got elected was Medicare
Well,
for all.
And
And the thing for me is that I'm so tired of
I don't think that's
I'm
true.
so tired of everything in US politics is about changing the discussion. It's all about the discourse. But in terms of actual institutions, I mean, this is the point I was going to make really quickly. I mean, look, I was critical of some of the people on the left who totally discounted the Bernie Sanders movement, because I recognized that there were millions, literally millions of people, largely young people, who were new to left-wing politics, who were in the streets, who were organizing, who were in their communities, and who were inspired by Bernie Sanders' message. But the reality is that it's true that I don't think that at the end of the day that it had no impact, but the reality is that in terms of institutional impact, the institutions created by the Bernie movement, you can talk about Justice Dems, you can talk about a variety of other movements, almost all of them merged with the Democratic Party, almost every single one. And there are a few exceptions which are good, and that's important, but the reality is that the social movements have power when they can affect policy, and we were talking about the goal of affecting Medicare for all and all these things, and when social movements can lead to the creation of new independent institutions. But the reality is that the infinite gravity of the black hole that is the Democratic Party has devoured almost all of those institutions. And even when you look at DSA, I mean, this is something that I think about a lot. DSA is expressly not a party. They emphasize that. We are not a political party. Well, because they're not a political party, because they don't run candidates, their party is the Democratic Party. And all DSA, I mean, DSA has done some good things, as Danny was acknowledging, but at the end of the day, if you actually look at what they have done, the DSA has been an appendage of the Democratic Party that has helped get progressive Democrats elected, who in turn, who use DSA as a platform like AOC, and then when they get into power, they actually don't abide by, they're not disciplined by DSA, and they actually contradict some of the very same policies that DSA voted on, like BDS. When and where has DSA ever actually pressured people like AOC and these other Democrats they helped get elected to actually abide by and push for policies that they supposedly are fighting for? So for me, the question is not even just about the discourse. The discourse is part of it, but the discourse doesn't change politics. It's a combination of social movements and independent institutions that can end the labor movement, which is part of those institutions, which is so weak. Those are the forces that can actually put pressure on these politicians and force them to push for things like voting for Medicare for all, push for writing new legislation and voting on that legislation. But the reality is that so many of these institutions have just subjugated themselves to the Democratic Party when it should be the opposite dynamic. The Democratic Party should be afraid of those institutions because of the power they have putting the pressure on them. But instead, they've just subjugated themselves to the Democratic Party, and there's not going to be any change. I mean, people, the last thing I'll say here is that it's so incredible seeing all of these people who call themselves socialists, and they say that we need a workers' party. But what are they doing to create a workers' party? All they're actually doing is helping get progressive Democrats elected, and when the progressive Democrats elected, they say, oh, well, sorry, we have to be careful, we have to play three-dimensional chess with ourselves because we can't criticize them too much because the right wing is criticizing them. So what are they doing? Where's the Workers' Party? I agree the most important thing above all is that the United States needs an actual left-wing party, and that's not going to be the Democratic Party. But the people who say that in DSA, what are they doing to actually bring it about? In fact, they're the ones attacking Jimmy Dore, who's one of the most outspoken advocates for creating a new party.
Yeah, and Jimmy Dore's a comedian. I mean, what better person to lead a party in the United States? I mean, we just had a game show host lead a reality show host be the president, so it kind of makes sense. But I was going to say, I saw a tweet by a DSA leader, I think a leader of the Metro DC chapter, who was making the case that the energy just wasn't there for force the vote, and that's why members didn't support it. They basically voted it down. They have like 120 members in DC, and they got 28 votes. And he said the energy wasn't there. And I thought, the energy so often isn't there in DSA, at least when I see in DC where I live. The energy wasn't there for the Venezuelan embassy to defend it from Juan Guaido's coup. They sent one person and they came out for 2 hours on one afternoon to join the protest. The energy wasn't there when we protested the Bolivia coup. The energy, they did co-sponsor the rally against the assault on Iran, the killing of Qasem Soleimani, and we'll talk about this in a second. But the energy wasn't there. There weren't really like that many people I recognized from DSA. The energy, I'll answer. I'll mention that the energy wasn't there for the round of Assange protests we recently had here at the British Embassy and the Department of Justice. The energy so often is not there. And in many cases, the energy filters down from the top in an organization that calls itself socialist, and their leadership does not set a clear line. So you have all these divisions and different tendencies in DSA. And what I heard about the Venezuelan embassy is that there was some energy there, and then everyone got peer pressured by the SOCDEM or more liberal elements and said, you can't go out and defend a dictator. So the energy just never showed up. This is a problem of leadership. It's a problem of representing.
It's a structural problem.
It's a structural problem where you basically represent nothing, and then you get dragged into the inertia of what Ben called the infinite void of the black hole of the Democratic Party. And that's what we saw take place with Force the Vote. So then, I mean, what is DSA? It's almost like, what is it? And PSL, Party for Socialism and Liberation, which does run candidates, they had all 20 members of their.
Well, they had hundreds of members from all up and down the East Coast.
Well, they in the beginning for the Venezuela teach-in and the Venezuela protest, they were able to bring hundreds of people to DC to protest. And then when the Venezuela Embassy Protection Collective jumped off, all 20 members of their party in Washington participated full-time. All full-time. And that's because they have a line. The line is against imperialism. DSA does not have a clear line against imperialism. There's no consequence for violating whatever they vote for. That's why they can have Chris Hayes and Molly Crabapple as members who are like straight up imperialists, liberal imperialists. And that's what, the U.S. security state wants in a left-wing party or a party that identifies itself as socialist. They want fragmentation. They want nothingness. And while I'm not a member of the PSL, I don't identify with any clear ideological tendency. I don't wear socialism on my sleeve. I want you to judge me by my journalism. I want you to judge me by the things I say and the facts that I spit. But PSL, it has a line, and I think they have been much more effective in pushing back against empire, which is really the heart of the crisis that we're facing right now. And it's because they have they function like a real socialist party.
Yeah, no, I mean, first, what we're talking about, I think, is power, and politics is really about power. So when you have, and for me, my only experience with the DSA was actually when I was back in Boston, and this was, I think it was like 2014 or something, and I think I was at a anti-war demonstration around Syria. No, actually, it was a demonstration against the lifting of the charter school cap in Boston. And I was speaking to someone in the DSA, and I was already at that time pretty much a communist. So I asked him, I was like, oh, so what's your opinion on Cuba? And he's like, oh, well, that's not socialism. That's just a dictatorship. That's just state capitalism. And so those are the elements that really do lead the DSA, although I know that there's a lot of tendencies and forces that disagree, but overall,
Cuba is not socialist, but
no.
AOC is a McCain socialist.
Yeah. So
she's a John McCain socialist,
Marxist, Leninist, McCainist, or something like that. But I just think that we have to begin to, and it's not happening yet, although there's some of us who are doing this, but we do have to raise these very fundamental, as Anya said, structural issues with the movement. This is we have to be honest, I think, about where we're at. Like I think we're in a much more positive place than we were during the Obama period, where nothing social democratic was even touchable because Obama, in his large institutional backing, basically was able to do things like push Black people to support U.S. intervention more than at any other point in history, and make people think that they were doing well when actually they were doing really awfully during the aftermath of the so-called Great Recession, right? So there was this real shift to the right in so many ways during that period. And then there was this hope, I think, that a lot of people had that was based on a lot of the work that DSA had been doing. And their model did have success in the sense that they were able to mobilize millions of people to elect people like AOC and to try to get Bernie Sanders, who, during 2008, 2012 would have no chance in hell to even think about a primary run. But in 2016, he did have a chance that was taken away from him by the Democratic Party itself. But nonetheless, that happened, and that is and those forces still exist. But if they are going to continue to be sheepdogged and if we're going to keep allowing these forces to be captured by the Democratic Party, and we go through this constant phase of mobilizing, it takes a lot of energy. I mean, I don't touch electoral campaigns because you have to work very hard to try to win an election in this system as someone with politics like AOC. You have to have backing. You have to have popular backing, and you also have to have institutional backing, which she didn't have none of. She did have some of that. And to continue to go that route, right, I think would be a huge mistake for all of the reasons that have been listed here. And that's why there has to be, I think, this confrontation with, I call it a confrontation, but we could call it whatever we want, with forces like the DSA, whose entire model is this, right? And then when they have other things to do, they don't want to do it. Like force the vote was one of them, but they don't want to do it now. But we have to talk about what politically is this all about, because the DSA has a long history of this. I mean, they're out of the Michael Harrington kind of social welfare liberalism school of Marxism, which doesn't really exist, but that's where they come out of in the 70s and the 80s. And they've always had these flaws and inherent flaws. But the point is what are we going to organize instead? And that's the big question for me. And what I'm always thinking about, and I hope that this moment, this anger, disappointment, all of these experiences, right? The endless war, the endless austerity, and then you have progressive champions who aren't fighting it. I think this is just a key moment of in history. And while we shouldn't, I don't think, make it the only thing. I know, Aaron, as you were saying, that we shouldn't make it about them, but we should make it about this moment and what it all means for us moving forward. Because Max is getting old, I guess, and we have to make a revolution for Max. But we really have to change the organizing that we're doing, and the journalism. It relates to journalism, because journalism and organizing go hand in hand. Media and organizing go hand in hand. So, preaching to the choir at the Grayzone. But for anyone else who's watching, like we've got to move in a militant direction. Where this is not the moment. Pandemic, economic crisis, wars raging. We have Assange rotting in prison, and dozens of political prisoners here. We have Black people being gunned down by the police all the time. All of these things, they don't change without a massive and powerful movement. And we have to ask: is the DSA leading that, or are they doing work that, while commendable in some respects, the overall strategy is possibly, and I think definitely, a losing one?
Ben, you want to say?
Yeah, well,
Ian?
we're gonna start winding up here, because we're already at 2.5 hours.
Winding down.
Winding down. Winding up is the opposite. So we're gonna start winding down, and I didn't really. That was a very interesting conversation. We had a debate there, and it's good to have a debate. I mean, it's good that we don't all agree on exactly the same things. It helps. I think it's more interesting, but it also, for a media organization, it's good to have a variety of viewpoints. And the thing for me is that, there's just this obsession in the United States and on the left and in media circles particularly with trying to change the narrative. But the reality is that on so many of these issues, it's not about the narrative because the majority of Americans already agree. For years, this is not a product of Bernie Sanders. For many years, a majority of Americans have supported universal health care for everyone, including Republicans, by the way. And that number has gotten larger under Bernie Sanders, and the idea of Medicare for all has grown. But it's not a matter of trying to get the people on our side. The people already are on our side. The issue is the political class and capital and these institutions that are totally they're controlled by large pharmaceutical companies. It's one of the largest industries in the United States that has access to trillions of dollars of capital. So, I mean, this is also true for the anti-war movement. A majority of Americans have opposed the war in Iraq, the war in Syria. They don't want more troops in Afghanistan. They want to withdraw the troops in Afghanistan. The issue is not the lack of will on behalf of average people. The issue is the lack of will on behalf of the misleadership class, the so-called progressives in the Democratic Party who refuse to do anything to actually represent what their constituents want. Because, of course, the reality is their constituents aren't average working class people. Their constituents are the people that fund their campaigns. So, you know, I don't necessarily want to end on such a pessimistic note. I mean, I'm curious if anyone else has concluding thoughts.
Just the point I want to stress is that missing from, I think, this conversation a little bit is consideration that there's not an organized leftist force yet right now in the U.S. And no matter whether the squad does everything we want them to do, it won't matter until there's an organized grassroots cohesive movement. I think we can agree on that. I think. And certainly with now Democrats controlling the House, the Senate, and the White House, they can't blame everything on Trump anymore, and they can't blame everything on Russia. And so now will be an opportunity to really pressure them to be an actual party for average people, which of course they're not. But it will be a good opportunity to show just to what extent they're not, and to what extent people inside the party who are progressive are willing to actually fight for progressive things, whether it's for, healthcare for all at home, or for ending the war in Yemen, ending the dirty war in Syria and the murderous sanctions on Syria and Venezuela and Iran. This will be a good time for that. And I think putting the pressure on the squad is a good thing. But I guess I want to stress it's not just that. There also has to still be, which I think is bigger than our pay grade, is like a way to figure out how to mobilize a large movement of people. Like these media moments can be alluring, like Occupy Wall Street. I remember it was really exciting, but really that was like a block of real estate that there wasn't involving unions and working class people. It was a lot of young people inside, a spot inside one city. And it was important. It was exciting. And it was a media moment, and Forced to Vote was briefly a moment, but these are just moments. And I think I just want to stress that there's something bigger that has to happen, no matter how many media moments we can create, and no matter how much pressure we can put on people like the squad. It has to be bigger than that.
I mean, they were elected to do certain things. They made certain promises that they need to be held to, and they're just breaking them right before our eyes. It's not our responsibility to do it. It's theirs. And if they won't do it, then they should be replaced or made to feel very uncomfortable. And that's what took place. And I mean, what's the difference between it's not just the squad. Everyone talks about the squad. Maybe because it rhymes with fraud and it made a really good hashtag. Maybe because it was promoted and rammed down our throats and pumped in our brains and our cerebellum's Clockwork Orange style. I felt like my eyes were being held open to look at them and their coolness and and just watch all of AOC's live streams and everything and to fall for this. And it just wasn't going to happen. But there's so many other Democrats who say they're progressive. And when you actually go and ask them, I mean, I went on Capitol Hill at the start of the Venezuela coup and not only confronted AOC and just politely asked her, you can see in my voice, I'm so afraid to ask her the question because all these right wingers were abusing her. I'm not afraid, but I'm trying to be as gentle as possible so I don't seem like toxic masculinity. You know what I mean? do you think that there's anything you might want to say about Venezuela? I mean, and she's like, no, we're
Oh.
gonna release a statement and I'm going to run away and never say anything. All right. And then, whatever. But I was also Rosa DeLauro, who is like supposed to be one of the like progressive lionesses of the Congress, who's been there forever and is like so considered very left wing. And she just got in my face and was like, we got to sanction Maduro and get him out of there. Why would you want to not sanction Venezuela? We got to do it. She sounded like a neocon with like she had like blue hair dye on. So she looked cool. And like at a certain point, you just have to say like, to hell with these people and do something else. Like, I don't believe we're going to make them do it. We're not going to make them do it. Like, remember, Ben, that piece you did on Nicaragua sanctions passing without anyone speaking up against it completely unanimously? No one said anything. Why are we sanctioning Nicaragua? Does anyone care about sanctions? Sanctions are the biggest human rights violation in the world. They pose a greater threat to humanity than COVID. And all we hear about is COVID. And, there'll be like video on Twitter of police like beating the hell out of people. And then a bunch of liberals will come in and be like, where were their masks? Like, that's their reaction. Like, sanctions are making it impossible for Venezuela to fully confront the coronavirus pandemic. Sanctions are killing tens of thousands of people through excess deaths. Sanctions are preventing Syrians from rebuilding their homes. Sanctions are preventing Syrians from having wheat and forcing them into bread lines. Sanctions are starving North Koreans who are just Koreans. Sanctions all over the world. Sanctions on Russia. Sanctions on China. Sanctions on Nicaragua. Sanctions even being threatened against Germany for doing a pipeline deal with Russia. I guess we don't want the Germans and Russians to have peace. We want them to be at war. Like, that's never happened before. But it's this insane agenda destroying humanity, and nobody talks about it in Congress. How am I going to make them do it? I've been trying to make them do it my whole life. So it's just like you get to a certain point where you just have to say, screw them, kick them to the curb. Stop getting in the way of the political education we're doing. Stop misleading people. Danny, you write for Black Agenda Report. Glenn Ford came up with the term, the misleadership class. That is such an important term right now, and it can be applied to AOC. I think she's part of the misleadership class. We need to say that. We need to stop waiting for them to do something. They're never going to let me in their damn office. I used to talk to this guy who worked in Ilhan Omar's office on like Twitter DM, and he got fired. They probably found out he was talking to me or something. Like, we've all been like attacked and made so toxic. And what are we saying that's so wrong? Like, why do I have to be gaslighted into thinking there's something wrong with me and that I deserve to be blacklisted because nobody on Capitol Hill likes the cut of my jib? Why is that? It's because they are institutionally aligned with a party that is structurally a part of hyper-capitalism and imperialism. And we just need to call that out for what it is. That's what we're doing at the Grayzone. And right now in DC, we're under curfew. There was a curfew called. There was like a few thousand right-wing white guys running around. Basically, by the end, they were all getting drunk and hitting each other and like yelling at each other. They're like, cross the street this way, you pussy. No, you're a pussy. No, you're a pussy. They're all just calling each other pussies by the end. So they pose no threat to the greater DC, but the entire city is under curfew right now. The entire city. Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, we sound like yuppies. Like, we can't order dinner now. We can't order our Uber Eats. But think about the situation we're in. The whole city was put under curfew because a bunch of a Trump mob wanted to be on Capitol Hill. Nobody came out to confront them. And everybody's scared of COVID too. So there's just so many layers of fear to prevent people from actually doing something. We have to be the ones to call this out. And someone said, I love to hear myself speak. This is actually just cathartic for me. Yeah. So I just need to like get this off my chest. I'm done.
Because we're all mad as hell and aren't going to take it anymore.
I am mad.
And that was exactly what was going through my head. So I'm glad you brought that up.
I'm mad. Everybody should be mad. And so many people are not mad. They've just given up and they're ready to just take some opioids and fentanyl and die. That's the saddest thing about what's going on out there. Over 50% of this country doesn't even vote. And look at Biden. You think that guy cares? He's like, that's the guy that cares.
This is only going to get more extreme under Biden because they're not going to have the excuse of Trump. The squad is going to have to do more than performative actions.
Yeah.
And I think they're just going to be spending their time. My prediction is they're going to be spending their time making excuses for Biden while like throwing us statements here and there to make us feel like, oh, there's a wing of the party that's left, but we'll see.
Well, I want to just, I guess these are my last words. What Max said there about the misleadership class. I think this moment, now that we're moving into the quote unquote Biden era, it's going to be really important to have actual forces in the media, people on the actual left, taking on the role of exposing the black misleadership class, I guess we can call them the squad misleadership, whatever we want to call these forces, but they will be using their positions to, and we can predict this, right? This is one thing that we can predict, that because we have an understanding of how Washington works and who it works for, we know that the Democratic Party's newfound control, they may have won this. I don't know what happened in Georgia. I think they won that. So they'll have, some majorities in both the House, and so they'll have the White House, they'll have Washington basically, and we know what the danger that brings in this moment. That's fundamentally different than even when Obama came in 2008. We're in a fundamentally different period. This is like a real crisis, and the United States' empire, what it does in crises is it usually ratchets up war. It usually ratchets up a lot of these austerity policies, etc., to mitigate that crisis. And that will happen. And under a Democrat, it may be more likely, and this, I want to be proven wrong, but it may be more likely that the squad will capitulate to that and won't even have a rhetorical opposition to it to the same degree that it would under a Trump administration, where we see them tweet almost every day that they're for this and they're for that, and all of this. That could be over, because a lot of the base is going to breathe a sigh of relief. We saw it. I mean, I've talked to people who are Bernie supporters who are like, oh, I'm very glad Biden's in. Won't have to work as hard. Won't have to think about this as much. So there'll be less danger. I mean, that in and of itself, that way of thinking is extremely, divorced from reality, because there will be parts of Biden's administration that may roll back some Trump's policies. But on a lot of things, how the United States works, how imperialism works, is it keeps moving forward. It keeps chugging along. And we will see dangerous escalations in places around the world. We'll see the way that the United States responds to economic crisis, a health crisis, will be disastrous for so many people. And the danger of consolidating this idea that things are just going to get better because Biden is in office is all the more reason why we have to call out the Congressional Black Caucus, why we need to call out the squad, because they do, unlike the Congressional Black Caucus right now, the squad has millions of people who are ready for socialism, right? Ready for at least social welfare kind of socialism. So it will be important to make sure that this debate that's happening now continues in a time where a lot of people will see blue in Washington and say, all right, we're good. We're okay. We can accept sanctions on Nicaragua. We can accept, increased military escalations against China because of human rights or something. We're good with mass incarceration. Oh yeah, those protesters are just thugs. Remember when Obama said, protesters in Baltimore thug, like all that? That's okay. That mentality has a real reasonable chance of roaring back. And we have to be very vigilant about that, I think, in this moment. It's not the same period. There's certainly, Biden is not Obama. Biden is ineffectual. He's, certainly has a longer track record and a much more well-known one, but he will be protected by people who are much more effective than him at PR and at a whole lot of other things, which will bring real, I think, challenges for us. And so we have to be vigilant. That's my opinion. We have to be really vigilant against that, because there will be some people who will definitely tap out. They'll tap out of the fight for everything, for anything they're fighting for, Medicare for all. They'll tap out. We know that has a huge possibility of happening, especially at the leadership level.
I'll just say quickly, as my concluding remarks, is that no matter what happens with Congress, I agree that we're not going to have an impact there. But where I do think we have an impact is in the media conversation, especially on the progressive adversarial side, because as we've documented extensively during the Trump era, so many outlets got co-opted by the national security state narrative so many times, where all of a sudden the way to resist Trump was to venerate our intelligence agencies and to criminalize diplomacy with Russia, and anything that could be perceived to be somehow abetting or aiding Russia was all of a sudden anathema. It was something to oppose. And so many outlets, like ones that we all used to follow and in my case work for, like Democracy Now!, got duped by that. And what I love about the Grayzone, and it's obvious from tonight that we have some disagreements when it comes to, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, political philosophy or the nature of the squad, whatever, but is that we apply our principles not
I think it's
just
mostly tone.
yeah, is that we don't check our leftist principles at the edge of U.S. borders. We apply it to countries all around the world, and it's just been amazing to me to see how silent so many outlets have gotten when it comes to what we're doing around the world, which is really what the U.S. is. It's an empire, and there's been so much willful taking our eyes away from that when it comes to these other outlets. It's not looking at the impact of U.S. sanctions. Like, how many times do we hear about how U.S. sanctions on Syria are preventing it from reconstructing explicitly? That's the explicit aim of the Caesar Act, and forcing doctors to smuggle in medical equipment. Other outlets don't even discuss it. And what I love about the Grayzone is that we embrace that, and we embrace the contempt of sadists who support these policies. We like that, and I think that creates a very good lane for us, as well as outlets like Black Agenda Report in the Biden era, where Biden, by all accounts, will continue so many of these policies, and so many other outlets have been conditioned to just go along with them and not see them as an aberration or as anything to oppose. And I think there'll be plenty for us to expose and document, even though Trump will now, I think, thankfully be gone.
All right. Well, on that note, we're going to wind down here. One of the things we want to do before closing.
Let me make a quick remark before you close it out. Just following up on Aaron, is that, well, I'll be continuing my rants on Katie Halper's show at around like 10:30 or like whenever this ends. I just one of those days. But just following up on what Aaron said, I mean, I think like Ben, Danny, and Anya are a little bit younger than me and Aaron, and I think we've gone through different processes. And me and Aaron came out of like the kind of professional media, the professional left media. We were around The Nation and Democracy Now!, and we've wound up in the same place. So I don't want anyone to get it twisted that we have there's pretty much no fundamental disagreements. But I think what we're doing, this is my craft, journalism. This is Aaron's craft. This is all of our craft. This is what I can do. It's what I spend all my time doing. And one of the most important things right now for journalists is to expose institutions. And exposing Congress they have failed us. All of our core institutions have completely failed us. And I even see liberals saying that. And this is the only thing that will produce change psychologically. It will create this psychological and emotional momentum for change in this country. Real transformational change. So I think Force the Vote helped that process of exposing Congress. But I also think Aaron is focused on one institution, an international multilateral institution this year. And his journalism, if we had like actual journalistic institutions that valued real journalism, would get an award. What he's done on the OPCW and exposing the corruption of that institution is so important. And that's what I think the Grayzone does best, is to take these corrupted institutions and lift the cover while the rest of the media provides that cover. That's Bellingcat's role. And we do that with the OAS. I mean, Anya focused on the OAS. Ben focused on it. Ben is focused, done so much on corporate media. And I just want to say that's what we exist for. And I think we're just using investigative journalism for political education to give people that psychological momentum they need to take the next step.
Yeah, well said, Max. Well said. And I just want to conclude here by acknowledging, I mean, there's so many great comments. The conversation was going there pretty, it was, flowing organically, so I didn't want to interrupt. But going back to some of the super chats, I want to thank Chuck Zlatkin, who said Jimmy Dore and Max Blumenthal are my favorite comedians. I would say it's fair to include Max in there.
Chuck.
Max.
We know
And-
Chuck, so we just want to give him some recognition.
Yes,
Chuck is a
hey,
great
Chuck.
labor organizer in New York.
And
City.
and
Organizes
Chuck,
a rally for Assange every single week in New York City.
and Chuck jokingly said that Aaron Maté is his favorite centrist, which oof, I wouldn't say that. Ow. I want to thank the Sand Queen. Thank you so much for the support. And the Sand Queen said, all of you verbalize my thoughts in a perfect way. I'm glad we could. Thanks to the greatly named You Have a Good Point. Thanks to Art Wallace. And thanks to, I mean, there's so many comments here. Thanks to Leon Lawrence. Thanks to Mamo Kim. Stacy E. wrote, if the left had a shed of the fight the right had, we'd have Medicare for all. I love Aaron. We need him. So see, Aaron, you have some fans here. Not everyone
right.
thinks you're a cryptocentrist. And and Stacy E specifically said she loves redhead Max. So just don't dye your hair blue like a Zoomer, Max.
There are definitely a lot of people who think Aaron's hot too.
And Danny's been getting
Okay.
Danny's dreaming. He's been getting those comments.
Danny's so dreamy. That's what somebody said.
Thanks to David.
We're gonna have a
David.
Grayzone bachelor auction
Yeah.
or a calendar, the Chippendales Grayzone
Got a-
calendar.
You gotta fund
I'll
independent
have
media
Steve
somehow.
from 90210 stand in for me.
Well, thank you to Marino Vallejo. Thank you to Raquel Velo. So lots of great comments from so many people. People were saying that they want us to do more live streams. Oh, I forgot to mention, there was a really good comment earlier. There's so many that keep going away and I can't go back up. But someone made a really good comment earlier about while we're talking right now, I mean, just as a reminder of how serious these issues are, while we're talking right now, Israel has been bombing Syria again. Israel just bombed Syria in the third attack in 10 days. By the way, I should mention that Israel recently admitted that that Israel admitted that it attacked Syria at least 50 times in 2020. And that's a conservative estimate from Israel itself. So, I mean, this is not, unlike a lot of people on the left who kind of speak in academic terms and hypotheticals, this is not hypothetical. We're talking about lives being taken right now as we speak. I mean, it couldn't be more urgent. So we just want to thank everyone. And, a lot of people have been saying that we should do more live streams. So, we're going to try to do that more often. And I should mention that in addition to the YouTube we have here, the YouTube stream, you can also go, I'm going to get up on the screen here. You can go to Twitch. Right now we have a Twitch stream going on that is, it's causing an infinite feedback loop. I shouldn't be doing that. But so you can go to twitch.tv/The Grayzone News, and you can follow us there. We're new to Twitch, but we have our stream there, and we're going to do more stuff on YouTube. So on that note, I just want to thank everyone and give everyone here in the chat some final thoughts. None. All right, cool.
Max doesn't shave his eyebrows.
Yeah, they don't really exist. So
Just
All right. Well, thanks to everyone in the chat, both on YouTube and Twitch. And we will definitely do more of these soon, especially when Biden comes in and a lot of the media the media that has been criticizing the U.S. government nonstop is going to be radio silence. So definitely go to thegrayzone.com, and you can also go to patreon.com/grayzone. Please, everyone watching on YouTube, subscribe to our channel and give us the thumbs up, please. It helps us with the algorithm, which sometimes hurts us, but we're trying to keep growing. And peace.
And
We'll
follow
talk to you all
Danny
next time.
Haiphong as well. Follow Danny Haiphong as well. We're at Black Agenda Report, and where else, Danny?
Yeah, subscribe also to the Left Lens, hit that bell and all that stuff. Because
YouTube
yeah,
channel.
algorithms are tough. We got a good interview tomorrow with Luna Oy in Vietnam. So if people are interested in what Vietnam is like and what it's doing and internationalism and stuff like that, definitely come over to the Left Lens, subscribe. And we're doing regular work there.